There is a gate. Old wood, weathered gray by centuries of rain and sun, held together by iron bands gone rust-red with age. It stands slightly ajar as though waiting. Beyond it, you can see the edge of something green, a glimpse of leaves catching the last golden light of evening. The air smells of earth and stone, of herbs you cannot quite name, of bread baking somewhere in the distance. This is not your world. Not quite. This is a threshold between what you know and what has been forgotten, a doorway into a time when the world moved more slowly. When silence was not emptiness, but fullness. When the simple act of planting a seed carried the weight of prayer. You stand before this gate in the twilight hour. That in-between time when day has not quite surrendered to night. Somewhere beyond the monastery walls, a bell begins to ring. Not the sharp, insistent clanging of modern alarms, but a deep, resonant tone that rolls across the hills like a gentle wave, calling the monks to evening prayer. The sound doesn't demand, it invites. It marks the passage of time not as something to be conquered, but as something to be honored. Push the gate open. Feel the smooth wood beneath your palm, worn soft by countless hands before yours. The hinges creak, a sound that is somehow comforting, a voice of age and endurance. As the gate swings inward, you step from the dusty path into the garden, and the world shifts around you. The light here is different, softer. It seems to come not just from the setting sun, but from the very air itself. As though the garden holds light within its leaves and releases it slowly, reluctantly, as darkness approaches. The shadows are long and gentle, stretching across carefully tended beds where plants grow in ordered rows. Their leaves rustling in a breeze you can barely feel against your skin. This is a monastery garden somewhere in medieval. You're perhaps in England's green valleys, or France's rolling countryside, or tucked into the hills of Germany or Italy. The exact location doesn't matter. What matters is that this place existed in countless variations. Across the centuries we call the Middle Ages. Within these walls, behind gates like this one, men in rough brown robes devoted their lives to prayer and labor. To the preservation of knowledge and the cultivation of the earth. You walk slowly down the central path, and the gravel crunches softly beneath your feet. On either side, raised beds hold plants in various stages of growth. Some you recognize: the feathery tops of carrots, the broad leaves of cabbage, the climbing tendrils of peas. But others are strangers to you. They're a plant with thick, pale stems and glossy dark leaves. Here's something with delicate white flowers and roots that bulge mysteriously beneath the soil. And there, in the corner, a sprawling mass of greenery that seems almost wild, yet grows within its designated space with disciplined abundance. These are the forgotten vegetables, the lost crops, the plants that once fed thousands, that appeared in recipes now stored only in crumbling manuscripts, that grew in gardens across Europe but have nearly vanished from human memory and modern tables. They have names you've likely never heard: Skirret, Alexander's, Salsify, Good King Henry. They taste of flavors we've collectively forgotten, offer textures our palates no longer recognize. They are ghosts made solid. History you can touch and smell and diff. You were truly here, taste. But you are here, in a way. You've walked through the gate. You've entered this space between waking and sleeping, between history and imagination. And as the evening deepens around you, as the first stars begin to prick the darkening sky, you feel yourself settling into this slower rhythm, this quieter world. A monk passes you on the path, his face hidden within his hood, his hands tucked into his sleeves. He doesn't acknowledge your presence, perhaps he cannot see you. This visitor from a future he cannot imagine. He moves with unhurried purpose toward the chapel, answering the bell's persistent call. You watch him go, noticing the careful way he steps, as though even his footfalls are a form of meditation. Each movement deliberate and conscious. The garden is settling into evening now. The bees that hummed among the flowers throughout the day have returned to their hives. Birds call from the fruit trees that line the garden's outer walls, settling songs, gentle warbles that speak of rest and safety. The light continues to fade, turning everything soft and dreamlike. blurring the edges of the world until you're not quite sure. Where the garden ends and the sky begins, this is where we'll spend our time together in this threshold space. This twilight garden, where the past grows green and present, we'll walk these paths as the monks once walked them, morning and evening, season after season, year after year. We'll learn the names of plants that have no place in modern gardens, taste flavors that have vanished from contemporary cuisine, understand a way of life that measured time not in minutes, but in seasons, not in productivity, but in patience. The gate swings shut behind you with a soft click. You're inside now, enclosed within these ancient walls. The world beyond, with its noise and hurry, its bright screens and constant demands, fades away like a dream upon waking. Here, there is only the garden, the gathering darkness, the scent of growing things, and the distant sound of monks' voices rising in plain song, their Latin words flowing like water over smooth stones. Take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the evening air cool against your skin. This is a place of safety, of simplicity, of slow and sacred rhythms. Nothing here will rush you. Nothing here will demand more than your presence and your attention. The vegetables grow at their own pace. The seasons turn in their ancient pattern. And the monks tend their garden with the patient devotion of those who understand that some things cannot be hurried. As full darkness approaches, someone begins lighting the lanterns that hang along the garden paths. Small flames flicker to life, casting pools of golden light that push back the shadows just enough to see by. In this gentle illumination, the garden transforms once more, becoming a place of mystery and quiet beauty. The vegetables seem to glow from within, their leaves catching the lantern light and holding it like cupped hands. Holding water, we'll return to this gate many times in the hours to come. We'll pass through it in different seasons. Spring's hopeful green, summer's abundant growth, autumn's harvest-heavy richness, winter's stark and sleeping beauty. We'll see it in different lights. Dawn's soft pink, midday's bright clarity, afternoon's golden warmth, and countless evenings like this one, when the day releases its hold and allows the world to rest. But for now, for this moment, simply stand here in the gathering darkness and let the peace of this place settle over you like a blanket. Listen to the crickets beginning their night song. Smell the herbs releasing their fragrances into the cooling air. Feel the solid earth beneath your feet, the same earth that has fed humanity for millennia, that holds within its dark richness the seeds of past and future. The bell has stopped ringing. The monks are at their prayers now, their voices a distant murmur from the chapel. The garden is yours, alone yours, and the plants, yours and the nights. And as the last light fades from the western sky, as the stars brighten overhead, as the moon rises pale and round above the monastery walls, you understand that you've crossed more than a simple garden gate. You've stepped into a story that has been waiting to be told. A history that has been sleeping in the soil. A world that wants to be remembered. The forgotten vegetables are ready to share their secrets, to reveal their lost flavors. To show you what we've allowed to slip away in our rush toward the future, so let us begin. Let us walk these ancient paths together, you and I, and learn what the garden has to teach. The night is long, the stories are many. The gate, that old wooden gate with its rusty hinges, stands ready to let us pass back and forth, between remembering and forgetting. Between history and dreams, between the world that was and the world that might yet be again, the monastery wakes before dawn. In the deep blue darkness, before sunrise, when the stars still blaze cold and bright, the first bell sounds. It is the bell for vigils, the night office, calling the monks from their narrow beds in the dormitory to the chapel for prayer. This is the rhythm that governs everything: the divine office, the Opus Dei, the work of God. 7 times each day, the bells ring. 7 times, the monks cease their labor and gather to sing the psalms, to chant the ancient words, to turn their minds and hearts toward the divine. But between these moments of prayer, there is work. Always work. And for many monasteries across medieval Europe, the most important work happened here, in the garden, in the fields, in the orchards that spread beyond the cloister walls. You see, These men were not only monks, they were also farmers, gardeners, orchardists, and herbalists. They were the preservers of agricultural knowledge in an age when such knowledge could mean the difference between survival and starvation. They were living libraries of plant lore, walking encyclopedias of growing seasons, soil types, seed saving, grafting techniques, and the countless small skills required to coax food from the earth. Walk with me now around the cloister, that covered walkway that surrounds the central courtyard of the monastery. Our footsteps echo softly on the stone floor and through the arched openings. You can see the garden in the pale light of dawn. Frost glitters on the leaves. It is autumn now, or perhaps early spring. One of those liminal seasons when the world holds its breath between abundance and scarcity. The cloisters were places of meditation, of quiet walking prayer. Monks would pace these covered walkways, their lips moving silently as they memorized psalms or contemplated scripture. But they were also places of transition. The cloister connected the chapel to the refectory, the dormitory to the chapter house, the sacred to the practical. And always, always, the garden was visible through those arched openings. A constant reminder of the earth's presence, of humanity's dependence on the soil and the seed in the scriptorium, which we can glimpse through another arched doorway. A monk sits hunched over a desk, his hand moving carefully across parchment. He is copying an herbal book of plants and their uses. The work is slow, painstaking. Each letter must be formed perfectly, each illustration drawn with botanical accuracy. These herbals are treasures, repositories of knowledge accumulated over centuries. They describe plants both common and rare, detail their medicinal properties, explain when to plant and harvest them, record their culinary uses. Many of these herbals survive still, preserved in libraries and museums. If you could read the Latin script, if you could turn their pages carefully, for they are fragile now. Their parchment dry and brittle with age, you would find plants, sage, rosemary, mint, thyme. But you would also find detailed descriptions of plants that puzzle modern botanists. Plants whose identities have been lost, whose uses are now mysterious. And among these mysteries are our forgotten vegetables, described in words written by men who grew them, cooked them, ate them, and knew them as intimately as you know the food in your own kitchen. The monasteries were, in many ways, islands of stability in a turbulent world. Outside their walls, kingdoms rose and fell. Wars raged across the countryside, leaving fields burned and villages abandoned. Plagues swept through populations, killing without mercy or reason. But the monasteries endured. They were built to last: solid stone walls, self-sufficient economies, communities bound by shared purpose and strict rules. This stability allowed for something rare and precious: continuity. A monk might spend 40 years in the same monastery, working in the same garden, selecting seeds from the same plants year after year, gradually improving the variety, learning its preferences, understanding its character. And when that monk died, his knowledge didn't die with him. It passed to the younger brothers, was recorded in the monastery's books, became part of the living tradition of that place. This is how agricultural improvement happened in the Middle Ages, not through formal scientific research, but through patient observation, careful selection, and the accumulation of small insights over generations. The monk who noticed that one particular skirret plant produced sweeter roots than its neighbors would save seeds from that plant. The brother who observed that Alexander's grew better in partial shade than full sun would pass that knowledge to his successor. Season by season, decade by decade, century by century, the garden improved, and it wasn't only vegetables that the monks cultivated. The monastery gardens were complex ecosystems, carefully designed to meet multiple needs. There were vegetable gardens, yes, but also herb gardens filled with medicinal plants. There were orchards with fruit trees and nut trees. There were fish ponds where carp and other fish were raised for eating on fast days. There were beehives for honey and wax. There were barns for livestock, though meat was often forbidden or restricted in monastic diets. Everything connected. Everything served multiple purposes. The herb garden provided medicines for the infirmary, flavoring for the kitchen, and ingredients for the various preparations used in religious ceremonies. The orchards provided fruit for eating and for making preserves, wood for building, and fuel and beauty for contemplation. The vegetables fed the monks through the long months when fresh food was otherwise unavailable. But they also fed the poor who came to the monastery. Gates seeking charity, for this was another function of the monastery garden. It was an act of mercy, a way of embodying Christ's command to feed the hungry. Every day after the monks had eaten their simple meals, any excess food was taken to the gate and distributed to the poor. And in times of famine, when crops failed in the surrounding countryside, the monasteries carefully managed. Stores often meant the difference between life and death for local populations. The dawn is brightening now. The sky has shifted from deep blue to pale gray, and the frost on the garden plants sparkles like scattered diamonds as the first rays of sun touch them. Another bell rings, the call to lauds, the morning prayer. You watch as monks emerge from various buildings and converge on the chapel, moving silently in the growing light. Their brown robes blend with the earth and stone, making them seem almost like extensions of the monastery itself, as though they've grown here like the vegetables, rooted in this place. Shaped by its rhythms and requirements, after lauds, some of the monks will break their fast perhaps with bread and ale, perhaps with something from the garden if the season permits. Others, particularly during Lent or other fasting periods, will eat nothing until the midday meal, but all will soon be at work. Some in the scriptorium, some in the workshops, some in the fields and gardens. For the rule of Saint Benedict is clear: idleness is the enemy of the soul. The monks must pray, yes, but they must also work, and in that work in the patient, repetitive, humble work of tending the earth, they find another form of prayer, another way of turning their hearts toward God. The garden awaits them. The vegetables are ready for attention, weeds to be pulled, plants to be thinned, seeds to be collected, beds to be prepared. The work is never truly done, only paused between one season and the next, one day and the next, one breath and the next. And in this endless cycle of labor and rest, growth and harvest, planting and gathering, the monks find meaning, purpose, and a deep connection to the earth that sustains them. But what exactly grew in these gardens? What were these vegetables that we've now forgotten? The frost is melting as the sun rises higher, and the plants emerge from their crystalline coating, wet and gleaming. Let us look more closely now at what grows here. Let us bend down and examine the leaves, the stems, the roots that hide beneath the soil. Let us begin to know them by name, these forgotten companions of our ancestors' tables. These lost flavors of history. In the beginning was the seed. Small, dry, seemingly dead-end, yet containing within itself everything necessary for life. The monks understood this paradox deeply. They saw in the seed a perfect metaphor for resurrection, for the promise that death is not the end, but the beginning of transformation. Christ himself had used the image. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. So when a monk pressed a seed into the dark earth, he was not merely planting a vegetable. He was enacting a sacred drama, participating in the divine mystery of death and rebirth. His hands, rough and calloused from labor, became instruments of grace. The soil became an altar, and the garden this ordinary patch of earth enclosed by stone. Walls became a temple where the deepest truths of existence were revealed. In the simplest acts, this understanding permeated everything. About monastic gardening. It influenced how seeds were stored often in the church itself, where they would be blessed before planting. It shaped when planting occurred often on saints' feast days, with prayers offered for the crop's success. It determined how the garden was organized, sometimes in cruciform patterns, with the 4 beds representing the 4 Gospels or the 4 rivers of Eden in the monastery library. Locked away in chests to protect them from damp and mice were books more precious than gold. These were not only Bibles and psalters, but also herbals and agricultural treatises, the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Some had been copied from ancient Roman texts. The knowledge of Plinian, Columella, and Palladius preserved through the copying work of countless monks. Others contained original observations. New techniques developed in this very monastery or traded with other houses in the network of religious communities that spanned. Europe turned the pages of one of these books carefully. For the parchment is old and precious, and you'll find exquisite illustrations alongside dense Latin text. Here is a drawing of a plant you recognize. Garlic, its bulb clearly depicted, its hollow stems precisely rendered. And here is one you don't recognize. A plant with compound leaves and a cluster of small roots. Labeled Caesar in medieval. Latin, what we'll come to know as skirit. The text describes not only how to grow the plant, but also its symbolism, its spiritual meaning. For the medieval mind made no sharp distinction between the practical and the spiritual, the material and the mystical. A vegetable was not just food, it was a gift from God, a lesson in theology, a reminder of divine providence. Its growth from seed to harvest mirrored the soul's journey from sin to salvation. Its role in sustaining physical life pointed toward the spiritual sustenance offered by Christ. This fusion of practical knowledge and spiritual meaning is perhaps most evident in the monastery's calendar. The medieval church year was a complex cycle of feasts and fasts, of celebrations and penances. And the garden responded to this calendar, providing the right foods at the right times. During Lent, that long period of fasting before Easter, the monks ate no meat, no eggs, no dairy. They survived primarily on bread, beans, and vegetables. The garden had to provide enough variety and nutrition to sustain them through these austere weeks. But fasting wasn't only about deprivation, it was also about awareness. About being conscious of what you ate and why. When your diet was simple, when you ate the same basic foods day after day, you learned to notice small differences, subtle flavors. You appreciated the first tender greens of spring after a winter of stored roots. You savored the sweetness of a carrot pulled fresh from the earth. You understood food as gift, not as commodities, something that required patience, labor, and grace to produce. And you learned the plants themselves, not as abstractions or generic items in a catalog, but as individuals with distinct personalities and preferences. This skirit plant grows sweeter than its neighbor. That patch of Alexander's thrives in the shadow of the wall, while the other struggles in full sun. These good King Henry plants are older, more established, their roots running deep. Those are newer, still finding their place. A good gardener and the monks were, by necessity. Excellent gardeners knew his plants the way a shepherd knows his sheep. Recognizing each one, understanding its needs, caring for it appropriately. This intimate knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship. A young novice, newly arrived at the monastery, would be assigned to work alongside an older brother in the garden. He would learn not from books, but from demonstration, from repetition, from patient correction. He would learn when to plant by watching the elder monk check the soil's temperature with his hand, feel its moisture, crumble it between his fingers. He would learn when to harvest by observing how the elder examined the plants, looking for signs of readiness that could not easily be put into words but which experience made obvious. And always, there was prayer. The monks might work in silence, but their silence was not empty, it was filled with interior prayer, with the continuous turning of the heart toward God. Or they might chant psalms as they worked, their voices blending with the sounds of the garden, the buzz of bees, the rustle of leaves, the calls of birds. The work and the prayer were not separate activities, but two aspects of a single offering. A seamless unity of body and soul, earth and heaven, in the seed room, a cool, dry chamber where the monastery seeds were stored from one season to the next. Each variety had its place. Clay pots and linen bags held the precious seeds, each one labeled in careful script: Caesar, Hippocelinum, Atriplex, Blightum. These Latin names were links in a chain stretching back to ancient Rome and forward into the future. Some of the seeds in this room were descended from plants that had grown in Roman gardens 1,000 years earlier, and some would still be growing in this same garden 500 years hence. Barring war or plague, or the dissolution that would eventually come to sow. Many monasteries, the monk responsible for the seeds often, the gardener himself, treated them with reverence. He knew that seed saving was perhaps the most important task of the year. A poor harvest could be survived if good seeds were saved for next year. But lost seeds meant lost varieties, lost flavors, lost knowledge. So he selected carefully, saving seeds only from the best plants, the healthiest, most productive, best-tasting specimens. Over time, this selection improved the monastery's varieties, adapting them perfectly to local conditions. And sometimes, seeds were shared. When monks from another monastery visited, or when a new house was being established, seeds might be given as gifts, precious packets of carefully saved seed that carried with them not just the potential for food, but the accumulated selection and knowledge of generations. In this way, excellent varieties spread across the monastic network, while each house also maintained its own unique strains, its own contributions to the living library of European agriculture. The seed was indeed sacred, not worshipped, but honored as a vessel of divine creativity, a tiny miracle of potential and promise. And when spring came, when the soil warmed and the days lengthened, when the time was right according to the calendar and the weather and the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the monks would take these seeds from their storage, carry them to the garden, and press them into the earth with prayers on their lips and hope. In their hearts, they would water them if the rains didn't come. They would thin them when they sprouted too thickly. They would weed around them, giving them space and resources to grow. They would watch over them through the long growing season, protecting them from pests and diseases as best they could with the limited tools available. And they would wait, with the patience that comes from living according to rhythms larger than individual desire, for the seeds to fulfill their promise, to complete the cycle, to provide once again the sustenance that made community possible. But what would emerge from those seeds? What plants would unfold their leaves toward the sun? What roots would swell beneath the soil? It's time now to visit the pantry, the cellar, the storerooms where the harvest was kept. It's time to meet the vegetables themselves. These forgotten companions that once were as familiar as bread, as ordinary as water, as essential as prayer. Descend with me now into the cool darkness beneath the monastery. The steps are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the stone curved and polished like river rocks. One hand trails along the wall as you go down, 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 feeling the temperature drop with each step, feeling the weight of the earth pressing in around you. At the bottom, there's a door. Heavy oak, bound with iron. It swings open on well-oiled hinges to reveal the undercroft of the monastery's storage cellars, where the harvest is kept through winter, where the surplus from summer's abundance is preserved against the lean months of cold and dormancy. The air here smells of earth and stone, of stored apples and aging cheese, of dried herbs hanging in bunches from the ceiling beams. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dimness. The only light comes from the candle you carry, its flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. But gradually, shapes emerge from the darkness. Barrels and baskets, jars and crocks, sacks of grain stacked against the walls, strings of onions and garlic hanging from hooks, and everywhere, in every available space. The carefully stored products of the garden, here is where you would have found them. These vegetables we've forgotten. Not growing in the earth above? Not yet. But stored in the forms that would carry them through winter roots, nestled in sand. Leaves dried and bundled, seeds saved for spring planting. Let us examine them now, one by one, and learn their names, their flavors, their stories in this barrel, half filled with damp sand, are roots that look almost like pale carrots or thin parsnips. But pull one out, brush away the clinging sand, and you'll see they're different, a cluster of slender white roots joined at the top, like fingers reaching downward. These are skirret roots, and they were once one of the most beloved vegetables in Europe. Scaramum ciceram in botanical Latin. Called Caesar by the Romans, skirwit in Middle English produces these clusters of sweet, crisp roots that taste something like a parsnip but more delicate. Something like a chestnut but less starchy. Something entirely their own that our modern palates have no reference for because we simply don't eat them anymore. They were everywhere once. Roman cooks prized them. Medieval recipes call for them again, and again roasted with butter, spoiled in pottage, candied with honey and spices for special occasions. They grew readily in the monastery gardens, asking little and giving much. Their roots swelling through summer and autumn, reaching peak sweetness after the first frost had touched them. Hold this skirret root in your hand and imagine it roasted over a small fire until the skin blisters and blackens slightly, then peeled to reveal the creamy white flesh beneath, steaming and fragrant. Imagine the texture tender but with a slight crunch, not mushy, like an overcooked potato but with integrity, with presence. Imagine the flavor sweet but not sugary, earthy but not bitter, complex and satisfying in a way that our few domesticated root vegetables can barely approach. But skirret had a disadvantage in the modern world. It's finicky to harvest. Those multiple roots tangled together, break easily, must be dug carefully. And they don't store as well as potatoes or even carrots. They want to be kept cool and slightly damp, not too wet or they rot, not too dry or they shrivel. They require attention, knowledge, care. And when the potato arrived from the Americas, that astonishingly productive. Easy to grow, easy to store, tuber skirret's days were numbered. Why fuss with delicate roots that require careful digging when you could grow potatoes that you could practically harvest with your hands? That stored for months with minimal care, that produced enormous yields even in poor soil? Set the skirret down gently in its sand-filled barrel and move on. Here, in another container, are roots of a different sort, long, thin, dark-skinned, almost black on the outside. Break one open, and you'll find white flesh that oxidizes quickly when exposed to air, turning a little gray, releasing a scent that's unmistakably vegetable but with something else. Underneath something almost like the smell of the sea. This is salsify, sometimes called oyster plant, and that maritime scent is not imaginary. When cooked, salsify develops a flavor that many compare to oyster's delicate, slightly briny, unlike any other vegetable. There were multiple types grown in monastery gardens: white salsify, black salsify, sometimes called scorzonera, and several related species. All produced these long, thin roots that had to be harvested with cardig too aggressively, and you break them, leaving the bottom half in the ground. The monks would have prepared salsify in various ways. Boiled until tender, then served with butter or oil. Roasted until the exterior caramelized and the interior turned creamy. Sliced thin and added to soups and stews. The young leaves were eaten too, in spring, before the plant put its energy into root development. Nothing was wasted. Every part that could provide nutrition or flavor was used, but salsify, like skirret, was not adapted for industrial agriculture. It's slow-growing, planted in spring, not ready for harvest until late autumn. It requires deep, loose soil for the roots to develop properly. And it's labor-intensive to prepare. That dark skin needs to be peeled away. And the flesh needs to be kept in acidulated water to prevent oxidation. When carrots and parsnips offered similar, if less interesting flavors with less fuss, salsify began its slow fade into obscurity, moved deeper into the cellar now, to where bunches of dried leaves hang from the ceiling beams like strange fruit. These are harder to identify, and their dried state leaves that were once green and vibrant are now brown and papery, shapes altered by the drying process. But labels attached to each bundle identify them. Atriplex blightum, bonus HENRICUS .ATRIPLEX dash, known in English as auric or auricky, was a common pot herb. Eaten like spinach throughout the Middle Ages. It came in multiple colors: green, red, purple, even golden. The colored varieties were especially prized because they added visual interest to otherwise monotonous meals. Auroch has a slightly salty flavor, which made it useful for seasoning dishes in times when salt was expensive and carefully rationed. Blightum strawberry spinach, or strawberry blight, was grown both for its leaves, which were cooked as greens, and for its peculiar fruit, small, red, clustered structures that looked somewhat like strawberries but tasted bland and slightly mealy. Not a culinary triumph, perhaps, but every source of nutrition mattered, especially during lean years. In bonus, Henrik is good, King Henry in English. Probably named long after the medieval period ended, was perhaps the most valuable of all the forgotten leafy vegetables. It's a perennial, meaning it didn't need to be replanted each year. Once established, a patch of good King Henry would produce for decades, sending up new shoots each spring that could be harvested like asparagus, and producing leaves throughout the growing season that could be cooked like spinach or chard. Good King Henry was a plant of the common people, growing in cottage gardens and on waste ground as well as in monastery gardens. It tolerated poor soil, needed little care, survived harsh winters, and provided abundant nutrition. The young shoots, harvested in early spring when little else was available, are tender and mild. The leaves, though slightly bitter when mature, are rich in vitamins and minerals. Even the seeds were collected and ground into flour during times of extreme scarcity. But good King Henry has a drawback. It contains oxalic acid, the same compound found in spinach and chard. Eat too much too often, and it can interfere with calcium absorption, potentially contributing to kidney stones. The monks wouldn't have known the biochemistry. They would have understood through experience that variety in diet was important, that eating the same thing day after day could cause problems. So they grew many different vegetables, rotated their crops, ate different things in different seasons. As you explore this cellar further, you find more treasures. Jars of preserved vegetables, packed in salt or vinegar. Crocks of fermented preparations, medieval versions of sauerkraut and kimchi. The fermentation process, preserving vegetables through winter, while also making them more digestible and adding beneficial bacteria to the diet. Strings of dried beans and peas. Baskets of turnips and beets and carrots. Varieties that would seem strange to modern eyes, shapes and colors we no longer see. Flavors that have been bred out in favor of uniformity and sweetness. There are roots of plants that straddle the line between vegetable and herb. Horseradish, fierce and pungent. Various types of radishes, some small and quick-growing, others huge and slow, like the winter radishes that could be stored for months. Burdock roots, long and thin and earthy tasting. And evening primrose roots, which were harvested before the plant flowered and eaten as a delicacy. And there are roots of plants that we now consider purely medicinal or even weedy. Dandelion roots, roasted and ground as a coffee substitute. Chicory roots, used the same way. Elecampane roots, candied with honey and eaten, both as treats and as medicine. And angelica roots, which were considered so potent that they were kept with the medicines rather than the food stores. The line between food and medicine was not sharp in the medieval world. Plants were understood to have properties hot or cold, wet or dry. According to the ancient Greek theory of humors, and meals were constructed to balance these properties, to maintain health, to correct imbalances. A person with a cold, wet constitution needed hot, dry foods. Someone suffering from excess heat needed cooling vegetables and herbs. It seems primitive to modern minds, but it represented a sophisticated understanding of food as something more than just calories as medicine, as therapy, as a tool for maintaining the balance of the body. Move to the far end of the cellar, where the air is coolest and driest. Here are the most precious stores, the seeds saved from the best plants, cleaned and dried and stored until spring. And here, too, are some of the monastery's medical supplies, the prepared medicines, the distilled essences, the carefully compounded remedies that the infirmarian would dispense to sick brothers or to the poor who came seeking help. Among these medicines, you would find preparations made from our forgotten vegetables. Skirret root boiled in wine was given to those suffering from weakness or recovering from illness. Salsify was believed to strengthen the liver and purify the blood. Good King Henry, despite its oxalic acid content, was used externally as a poultice to draw out infections and internally as a gentle laxative. The seeds of orac were used to induce vomiting, an important treatment in an age that believed many illnesses were caused by corrupted substances in the stomach. This integration of food and medicine, of kitchen and infirmary, reflects a worldview we've largely lost, one that understood the body as a complex system deeply influenced by what we put into it. That saw prevention as important as cure. That recognized the profound connection between diet and health. As you climb back up the worn stone steps, returning to the world of light and air, you carry with you mental images of these strange roots and leaves. These flavors and textures that most modern people will never experience. But images and descriptions are not enough. To truly understand these vegetables, we must see them growing, must follow them through the seasons, must learn their stories in more depth. And so, let us begin with skirt, that once beloved root that is now almost vanished. Let us give it the attention it deserves. Let us understand why it mattered so much and why it disappeared. The cellar was dark and cool, a place of storage and preservation. But the garden above is where life happens, where seeds transform into plants, where the sun and rain and soil work their ancient magic. Come, let us return to the light. Spring has come to the monastery garden. The frost that silvered the plants has given way to gentle rains. The bare branches of the fruit trees have erupted in white and pink blossoms. And in the vegetable beds, small green shoots are pushing up through the dark soil beans, unfurling their first leaves. Peas climbing their supports. And here in this bed near the south-facing wall, the distinctive foliage of skirt beginning its annual resurrection. Skirt, Siam Sasarum, is not grown from seed here. It can be, but the monks have learned that dividing established plants is faster and produces more reliable results. So each spring they carefully dig up some of the previous year's plants, separate the root clusters, and replant the divisions, keeping the best roots for eating and returning the smaller ones to the earth to grow for another season. The monk tasked with this work, Brother Thomas, let us call him, though his name is lost to history, kneels in the soft earth, his brown robe kilted up to keep it clean, his hands already dirt-stained despite the early hour. He works with practiced efficiency, but without haste, lifting each clump of roots carefully, examining them, making decisions based on decades of experience. This plant produced well last year. The roots are uniform, sweet-smelling even raw, free of disease or damage. He selects 3 good divisions to replant and sets aside the remaining roots for the kitchen. This plant's roots are more tangled, less developed. Perhaps it was in too much shade, or perhaps it's just an inferior specimen. He'll replant only 1 division from this and make a mental note about its location. Over years, through this patient selection, the monastery skirt has become perfectly adapted to this particular garden. This soil, this climate, skirt requires attentiveness. Unlike carrots or parsnips, which grow a single taproot, skirt produces a cluster of tuberous roots radiating out from a central crown. This makes harvesting tricky. You need to dig carefully around the entire plant, loosening the soil enough to lift it without breaking those delicate roots. Break them, and you don't just lose some of the harvest. You create ragged wounds that can rot when the plant is replanted. But in exchange for this care, skirt gives something special. A flavor that was once so prized that it appeared in the feast menus of kings. The 17th century diarist John Evelyn wrote that skirt roots, when properly prepared, were very nourishing, wholesome, and delicate. Much superior to parsnip, high praise from a man who knew his vegetables. Watch as Brother Thomas replants the divisions. He's prepared the bed, already forked it over to loosen the soil, worked in well-rotted compost from the monastery's midden heap, created shallow drills for the plants. Now he sets each division carefully in place, spreading the roots outward, covering them with fine soil, firming it gently around the crown. He spaces them about a foot apart, close enough to make efficient use of space. Far enough that each plant will have room to develop fully. He waters them in with a wooden bucket, pouring the water slowly so it soaks in rather than running off. And then he moves on to the next bed, the next task. The garden in spring is full of urgent work. Everything needs planting, transplanting, tending. There is no time to linger, yet the work must not be rushed. It's a paradox the monks have learned to live with. Urgency without anxiety, efficiency without haste, constant labor without exhaustion. The regular rhythm of prayer breaks up the workday, provides rest and perspective, prevents the kind of frantic intensity that leads to mistakes and burnout. The skirret will grow slowly through spring and summer. Unlike radishes or lettuce, which race from seed to harvest in weeks, skirret is patient. The foliage will gradually expand pinnate leaves resembling those of parsnip or carrot, but with a slightly different pattern, a subtly different shade of green. The plant will flower, if allowed, dumbles of white blossoms that attract beneficial insects, but the monks usually prevent flowering, at least on most plants, because allowing a plant to flower diverts energy from root development. They'll let a few plants flower for seed saving and for the bees, but most will be kept vegetative, their energy channeled into those sweet roots through the long days of summer. Brother Thomas will visit this bed regularly. He'll pull any weeds that appear: chickweed, bindweed, nettles, the persistent intruders that try to colonize any bare soil. He'll thin the plants if any have sprouted too thickly from seed dropped last year. He'll water during dry spells, though skirret is more drought tolerant than its delicate appearance suggests. And he'll watch. He'll notice which plants are thriving and which are struggling. He'll observe how they respond to the weather. Does this variety prefer cooler conditions or warmer? Does it produce better in the slightly heavier soil near the wall or the sandier soil near the path? All this information accumulates in his mind, unwritten but not forgotten. Part of the living tradition of this garden. By late summer, skirret plants are substantial, 2 feet tall, bushy, vigorous. But Brother Thomas doesn't harvest yet. He waits. Skirret, like many root vegetables, improves with a touch of frost. The cold weather triggers the plant to convert some of its starches into sugars. It's making the roots sweeter, more complex in flavor. So he waits through September, through October, until November brings the first real cold. Now, finally, it's time. The harvest begins on a cool, cloudy morning when the ground is still soft from recent rain as you're digging than when the soil is hard and dry. Brother Thomas returns to the skirret bed with a spading fork and a basket. He inserts the fork well away from the plant's center, careful not to pierce the roots, and levers gently, loosening the soil all around. Then, grasping the plant's crown, he lifts it free, and there they are, 6, 8, sometimes 10 white roots, each about the thickness of a finger, some straight, some curved, all joined at the top like a bunch of carrots that never separated. He shakes off the excess soil and places the plant in his basket. 1 down. 20 more to go in this bed. It's meditative work, this harvesting. Fork, lever, lift, shake, basket, fork, lever, lift, shake, basket. The rhythm becomes almost hypnotic, and Brother Thomas finds his mind drifting into wordless prayer. That interior silence where the distinction between working and praying dissolves entirely. His body knows what 2 decades of practice have made the movements automatic. His mind is free to rest in God, to exist in that space of pure presence where time seems to slow, where each moment is sufficient unto itself. By midday, the bed is harvested. The basket is full of skirret, more than enough for tonight's meal, and several more, with plenty left to store and sand in the cellar. Brother Thomas carries his harvest to the kitchen, where another brother, the cook, receives it with a nod of thanks. In the kitchen, the skirret must be cleaned. The cook takes them to the wash basin and scrubs them gently, removing the clinging soil, being careful not to damage the thin skin. Then comes the preparation. For tonight's meal, they'll roast them, a simple preparation that showcases the vegetable's natural sweetness. He separates the individual roots from each cluster, discarding any that are damaged or woody. The best roots are relatively straight and free from side shoots and skirret. Roots develop stringy lateral rootlets that are unpleasant to eat. But centuries of selection have reduced this tendency in the Monasteries variety. He arranges the cleaned roots on a flat stone that will be placed near the fire, not directly in the flames, but close enough to heat slowly and evenly while they roast. The cook begins preparing the rest of the meal: pottage of beans and barley, bread from the morning's baking, perhaps some cheese if it's not a strict fast day. Simple fare, but nourishing, and in its way, delicious. The monks don't eat for pleasure. Their rule requires moderation in all things, including food. But neither do they eat deliberately unpleasant food. What God has provided should be received with gratitude and enjoyed appropriately. The skirt roots are roasting now, their skins beginning to blister and char slightly. The kitchen fills with their scent, sweet, earthy, with something almost nutty underneath. The cook turns them occasionally, ensuring even cooking. After perhaps 20 minutes, he tests one, piercing it with a knife. It's tender all the way through. He removes them from the heat and lets them cool slightly before peeling away the charred skin. This is tedious work. Birch root must be peeled individually, but necessary. The flesh beneath is creamy white, steaming, fragrant. He arranges them on a wooden platter, adds a small lump of butter to melt over them if butter is allowed today, and carries them to the refectory, where the monks are gathering for the midday meal. The meal is eaten in silence, as most monastic meals are. One brother reads aloud from a sacred text, while the others eat. Their attentions split between the physical nourishment of food and the spiritual nourishment of Scripture. But though they don't speak, they notice. They taste. The skirt is sweet and tender, its flavor subtle but satisfying. Some brothers might prefer more strongly flavored vegetables, onions, garlic, herbs, but skirt has its place. It's gentle, unassuming, nourishing, without being heavy. It's a vegetable that doesn't demand attention but rewards it when given. Over the next weeks, remaining skirt will be served in various ways, boiled and mashed with butter and pepper, cut into pieces and added to pottages, candied with honey and spices for the Christmas feast, or simply stored in the cellar, buried in damp sand. Waiting for February or March when fresh vegetables are a distant memory and even humble, skirt seems like a luxury. But skirt's time is finite, though the monks cannot know this. Within a few centuries, their beloved sweet root will have nearly vanished from European tables. The potato will arrive from the New World, and skirt will be unable to compete with that easy-to-grow, high-yielding tuber. By the 18th century, skirt will be rare. By the 20th, almost extinct, preserved only in a few seed banks. Grown only by historical enthusiasts and eccentric gardeners, the flavor that Brother Thomas tastes today. The sweetness enhanced by frost, the subtle nuttiness, the tender texture, this will become unknown to most humans. A sensory experience that connected countless people across centuries will be severed, lost, forgotten, and with it will be lost a small piece of human diversity. A thread in the rich tapestry of agricultural knowledge that our ancestors wove over millennia. But for now, on this November day in the monastery garden, skirt still thrives. The harvest is good, the brothers are fed, and in the spring, the saved divisions will be planted again, the cycle will continue, the tradition will be maintained. For now, skirt is not forgotten. For now, it is as present and real as the soil, the sun, the rain. The patient hands that tend it. The afternoon light is fading. Brother Thomas returns to the garden to put away his tools and check on the other beds. Tomorrow, he'll harvest the parsnips. Next week, the last of the carrots. The garden is winding down as winter approaches, but the work never truly stops. There is always something to do, always care to be given, always the next season to prepare for, and in that continuity, that endless cycle of planting and harvest, growth and dormancy, the monks find something profound, participation in the eternal pattern of creation itself, the divine rhythm that pulses through all existence. They are gardeners, yes, but also much more. They are partners with God in the ongoing work of sustaining life, maintaining beauty, and cultivating hope in a world that too often seems dark and uncertain. The bell rings for Vespers, the evening prayer. Brother Thomas straightens from his work, wipes his hands on his robe, and turns toward the chapel. The skirt bed is empty now, harvested, ready to rest through winter. But in the cellar, the roots wait in their sand-filled barrels. And in the seed room, the crowns saved for replanting wait for spring. Nothing is truly over. Everything continues, transforms, returns in new form. This is the lesson of the garden, the wisdom of the seed. The promise that makes a monk's life, with all its routine and repetition, feel not like imprisonment, but like participation in something vast and meaningful and eternally renewed. There is a plant that grows wild along the coastlines of southern Europe. Thriving in the salt spray zone where few vegetables dare to venture, its stems are thick and hollow, its leaves glossy and dark green. Its flowers clustered in yellow-green umbels that glow in the seaside light. This is Alexander Smyrnium, Alisatrum, sometimes called horse parsley or black lovage, a plant so common in the Mediterranean world that it barely seemed worth cultivating. It simply grew abundantly, asking nothing, offering much, but in northern Europe. Beyond the Mediterranean's gentle reach, Alexanders didn't grow wild. If you wanted a tan, medieval cooks very much did want it, had to cultivate it. And so into the monastery gardens it came, carried north by monks who knew its value, who recognized in this humble coastal plant a treasure worth the trouble of cultivation. The time now is early spring. April, perhaps, when the world is more promise than fulfillment. The garden is awakening from winter's sleep, but slowly, reluctantly. Most plants are still in their early stages, tiny leaves on delicate stems. Everything small and vulnerable. But Alexander's is different. Alexander's is bold. The plants that overwintered for Alexander's is biennial. Taken 2 years to complete its life cycle are already substantial. Their thick stems, some as thick as a man's thumb, are pushing up rapidly now, taking advantage of spring's lengthening days. They're reaching toward the sun with an urgency that seems almost aggressive compared to the more modest growth of other plants. Sister? Margaret, for not all monastery gardens were tended solely by men. Some religious houses were home to women who brought their own knowledge and care to the work. Walks among the Alexanders with a sharp knife in a basket. She's come to harvest the young stems, which must be taken now, in these early weeks of spring, before the plant puts all its energy into flowering. Once Alexander's flowers, the stems become too tough and bitter for eating, but now, while they're still young and tender, they're delicious. She selects a promising stem, thick, but not yet hollow in the center, and cuts it cleanly near its base. The cut surface oozes slightly. Alexander's is a juicy plant full of sap. She trims away the leaves, which are too strong tasting for most uses, though they can be added sparingly to soups and stews for flavor. The stem goes into her basket, one after another. She moves through the bed, selecting and cutting, being careful not to take too many stems from any one plant, leaving enough foliage for the plant to continue its growth toward flowering. Because next year's crop depends on this year's flowers producing seed, the cycle must be maintained. The balance preserved between this year's harvest and next year's plants. The basket fills slowly. Alexander's is not a plant you can harvest carelessly or in large quantities. Each stem must be individually selected and cut. But the flavor is worth the effort, complex and distinctive, like celery, but with peppery notes. Earthy, but also slightly sweet, entirely unique in the kitchen. The cook receives Sister Margaret's harvest with approval. Alexander's is a spring treat, available only for a few weeks each year, and therefore especially appreciated. He has plans for these stems. Some he'll use fresh, cutting them into lengths and serving them raw with salsa. Simple preparation that showcases the vegetable's crisp texture and complex flavor. Some he'll blanch briefly in boiling water and then shock in cold water, a process that brightens their color and slightly mellows their intensity. These blanched stems can be kept for a day or two and used in various dishes, but today he's preparing a special dish, one reserved for feast days and honored guests. He'll cook the Alexander's stems slowly in stock until they're tender, then serve them, dressed with butter, pepper, and a squeeze of verjuice, that sour juice pressed from unripe grapes, an essential ingredient in medieval cooking before lemons became common, as he works. Preparing the other elements of the meal, the kitchen fills with the scent of Alexander's cooking, earthy and aromatic, unmistakably vegetable, but with something more. Something that hints at the wild coastal cliffs where this plant originally made its home. But let us leave the kitchen for a moment and return to the garden to understand Alexander's more fully. This plant has a story that stretches back to ancient times. The Romans knew it and valued it, cultivating it in their gardens and spreading it throughout their empire. They called it Ola Satrum, literally black vegetable, probably referring to the dark color of the seeds. The modern name Alexander's is thought to derive from a corruption of Olus Atrum, though some sources claim it was named after Alexander the Great, though the connection is unclear. After Rome fell and its empire fragmented, Alexander's remained, growing in monastery gardens and cottage gardens across Europe. It filled a crucial niche in the medieval diet. It was one of the first fresh vegetables available in spring. When winter stores were depleted and nothing else was yet ready to harvest, those early spring stems, crisp and flavorful, must have seemed like a miracle after months of dried beans, stored roots, and preserved foods. Alexander's appears again and again in medieval texts. Herbals describe it as hot and dry, good for digestion, useful for clearing phlegm. Cookbooks included in recipes Alexander's tarts, Alexander's in almond milk, Alexander's with pike or other fish. It was versatile, abundant, and free for those willing to gather it, wild or easy for those who cultivated it in gardens. But Alexander's, at a disadvantage. It wasn't evergreen. Unlike some pot herbs that could be gathered year-round, Alexander's had a limited season. And as European agriculture developed more sophisticated season extension techniques, as more year-round vegetables became available, Alexander's began to seem less essential. The fatal blow came from an unlikely source: celery. Or rather, celery's transformation from a medicinal herb into a vegetable. Wild celery is bitter and strong-flavored, barely edible, but through centuries of selection, primarily in Italy, gardeners developed varieties with thicker, milder stems. By the 17th and 18th centuries, these improved celeries were spreading across Europe, and they had significant advantages over Alexander's. They could be blanched to make them even milder and crisper. They were available later into the fall and winter, and they didn't have the slightly peppery, medicinal undertones that some people found. It's off-putting in Alexander's. Celery also benefited from agricultural intensification. As market gardening became more sophisticated, as cities grew and demanded fresh vegetables year-round, crops that could be produced consistently and in large quantities thrived. Alexander's, with its 2-year life cycle and its limited harvest window, couldn't compete. By the 19th century, Alexander's was already becoming rare in gardens. Cookbooks stopped mentioning it. Agricultural manuals no longer included cultivation instructions, and by the 20th century, it had almost entirely vanished from culinary use, persisting only as a wild plant in coastal areas and as a half-remembered curiosity in historical texts. But in this monastery garden, in this moment we're inhabiting together, Alexander's is still present, still valued, still part of the living tradition of food and cultivation. Sister Margaret finishes her harvest and heads to the chapel for the midday prayers. The cook finishes his preparations and rings the bell that summons the community to the refectory. And the meal is served Alexander's dressed in butter and verjuice, accompanied by bread, beans, and perhaps some cheese. The taste is complex, slightly bitter, slightly peppery, deeply savory. It's not to everyone's preference. Some of the younger sisters find it too strong, too medicinal, but the older members of the community, those who have eaten Alexander's every spring for decades, relish it. It tastes like spring itself, like renewal, like the earth's patient resilience. There's another significance to this meal, beyond the immediate satisfaction of hunger. In serving Alexander's today, the community is participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. The Romans ate this vegetable. The early Christian communities ate it. Monks and nuns across Europe. From Ireland to Italy. From Spain to Poland. Were at this very moment sitting down to similar meals, united not by communication or organization, but by shared practices, shared knowledge, shared participation in the rhythms of the agricultural year. This is what we've lost with our forgotten vegetables, not just flavors and textures. Though we've lost those two but connections, the connection to place, to season, to history. When you eat only vegetables that are available year-round, shipped from wherever they happen to be growing at the moment, you lose the sense of time passing, of seasons turning, of being rooted in a particular place with its particular climate and soil. The monks and nuns eating Alexanders in April knew, in their bones, that it was April. The presence of Alexanders on their plates told them where they were in the year's cycle, reminded them that winter was past, that summer was coming, that the garden would soon be abundant. Food was a calendar, a map, a connection to the living world, and when we severed that connection, when we replaced local, seasonal varieties with a handful of globally distributed crops available year-round, we gained convenience, but lost something precious, that sense of participation in natural cycles, that awareness of living within a particular place and time rather than in the abstract, placeless space of global commerce. But I'm getting ahead of our story. In this moment, in this monastery, those losses are still far in the future. Alexander's grows, is harvested, is eaten, is appreciated. The tradition continues unbroken. The knowledge passes from one generation to the next, and the plant itself thrives, both in the garden and in the wild places beyond the monastery walls. After the meal, after the afternoon's work, after vespers and the evening meal and compline, the final prayers of the Datha, community retires to their cells for sleep. The garden rests in darkness, the Alexander's stems already regenerating, preparing for tomorrow's growth. In a few weeks, the plants will flower, their yellow-green umbels, alive with insects. In a few months, they'll set seed, those dark, almost black seeds that gave the plant its Roman name. And those seeds will scatter, some to lie dormant until next spring, some to sprout this year and grow through the summer, overwintering as rosettes of leaves close to the ground, ready to send up stems next spring and continue the cycle. Nothing is static. Everything continues, changes, adapts. The garden tonight looks almost exactly as it did last night, and the night before, and the night 100 years ago. But it's not the same garden. Every plant in it is different. Every seed is the product of selection and chance. Every iteration is both continuation and change. This is the paradox of tradition. It persists by adapting, survives by changing, maintains continuity through constant renewal. The Alexanders will be here next spring, and the spring after, and the spring after that, until someday, they won't be. Someday the knowledge will be lost, the cultivation will cease, and Alexanders will return to being merely a wild plant, no longer part of human cuisine, no longer a marker of spring, no longer remembered, but that day has not yet come. Tonight, in this monastery, in this garden, Alexanders grows and waits for tomorrow's sun, and the tradition continues. And all is well? If you walk through the monastery garden in midsummer, when everything is at its peak of growth, you might miss the salsify entirely. It's not a showy plant. Its leaves are long and grass-like, a muted blue-green that doesn't catch the eye. It grows in quiet obscurity among more obviously productive plants, the towering peas, spreading squash, the bushy beans. You could walk right past it and never notice. But that's appropriate in a way. Because Salsify tragopagon porifolius, the purple or common salsify, it's called oyster plant, for reasons we'll explore, as a vegetable that teaches patience. It demands patience in its growing, requires patience in its harvesting, and rewards patience in its preparation. It is in every way amongst vegetables suited perfectly to a life structured around waiting, around the slow accumulation of small acts, around trust and processes that unfold in their own time. The salsify currently growing in this bed was planted last April, 14 months ago. It's a biennial, like Alexander's, though it's handled differently. Whereas Alexander's was planted and allowed to flower in its second year to produce seed, salsify is harvested before it flowers. Its roots dug up, while all the plant's energy is still stored below ground. Brother Benedict, for we need names for these people who are otherwise lost to history, kneels beside the salsify bed in late October. Examining the plants critically, he's looking for signs that they're ready for harvest. The leaves should be starting to yellow and die back, indicating that the plant is preparing for dormancy. The roots should have reached their full size. Though of course he can't see them beneath the soil, he can only make an educated guess based on experience. And on the size and vigor of the tops, He selects a plant and begins to dig. Inserting his spading fork about 6 inches away from the plant's base, Salsify produces a single long taproot, not a cluster like skewered. Not a round bulb like turnip, but a long, slender root that can extend 2 feet or more into the soil. If you insert your fork too close, you'll pierce the root and ruin it. Too far away, and you won't adequately loosen the soil around it. He works the fork back and forth, gently loosening the soil all around the plant. Then, grasping the leaves at their base, he pulls steadily, and the root slides up out of the soil along. Tapered cylinder, pale brown on the outside, perhaps 2 feet long and an inch thick at the crown. Tapering to a point at the bottom, success! The root is intact, undamaged. Brother Benedict shakes off the excess soil and lays the root aside while he digs the next one. One by one, the bed yields its treasure roots that have been growing for nearly a year and a half, storing up starches and sugars, developing the complex flavors that make Salsify worth the wait. This is the art of patience. Made visible, 14 months from seed to harvest. Think about that. In our modern world of instant gratification, of next-day delivery and fast food, the idea of planting something and then waiting over a year to eat it seems almost incomprehensible. Yet this was normal in the medieval world. Many vegetables took months to mature. Some, like Salsify, took over a year. You didn't plant for this week or next week. You planted for next year, for the year after, for the future. This required a particular kind of faith. Faith that you would still be here when the harvest came. Faith that the weather would cooperate, that pests and diseases wouldn't destroy the crop, that war or plague wouldn't disrupt everything. Faith that the effort was worthwhile, that the delayed reward justified the present labor, and it required community. Individual people die, but communities persist. Brother Benedict might not be the one who harvests these particular Salsify roots. He might become ill, or be transferred to another monastery, or die before October comes. But the monastery will remain, and someone will harvest them. And the knowledge he embodied when to plant, how to tend, when to harvest will persist. Because it's not held by one person, but shared. Across the community, and recorded in their books, and embedded in their practices. The harvested Salsify. Roots are taken to the washing area, where they're scrubbed clean. As the soil is washed away, the root's true appearance emerges, pale brown skin, almost beige, with a slightly rough texture. They look frankly unprepossessing, like long, thin parsnips that someone left in the ground too long. You wouldn't pick them up at a market and think, I must eat this. But appearances deceive. Break one of these roots and smell it. There's something earthy. Yes, but also something else, something almost metallic, with a faint hint of the sea. This is what earns Salsify its common name oyster plant when cooked, especially when prepared with butter or cream. The flavor suggests oysters, that same briny, slightly metallic, deeply umami taste in the kitchen. The cook faces one of Salsify's significant challenges. The roots oxidize rapidly when cut. The flesh is white, but exposure to air turns it gray-brown within minutes, making it unappetizing to look at, even if the flavor is unaffected. The solution, which medieval cooks discovered through trial and error, is to work quickly and to submerge cut pieces. It's immediately in acidulated water with vinegar or verjuice, added which slows the oxidation. The cook peels the roots, a tedious process, as each root must be peeled individually, and the skin, though thin, clings stubbornly. The white flesh beneath is revealed, and immediately he drops each peeled root into his bowl of vinegar water. When all are peeled, he cuts them into lengths and sets them to boil in salted water. The cooking takes time, perhaps half an hour, for the roots to become truly tender. Undercooked Salsify is unpleasantly fibrous, but cooked properly, it transforms into something almost creamy, with a texture unlike any other vegetable. It's not mushy like overcooked potato, not firm like properly cooked carrot, but somewhere in between, yielding, smooth, almost silky. When the roots are tender, the cook drains them and dresses them simply. A knob of butter, some pepper, a sprinkle of salt, a splash of vinegar to brighten the flavors. This is how they'll be served tonight as side dish, accompanying the main pottage, offering a different texture and flavor, adding variety to the meal. At table, the monks eat slowly, appreciating what they've been given. The salsify's flavor is subtle but distinctive, earthy, and slightly sweet, with that characteristic hint of oyster that gives the plant its name. It's not a vegetable that demands attention, but it rewards those who pay attention, offering complexity and depth to those who take the time to notice, and that, perhaps, is why salsify eventually fell from favor. It requires attention in growing, in harvesting, in preparation, in eating. It doesn't shout its virtues. It doesn't offer instant gratification. In a world increasingly oriented toward speed and efficiency, toward bold flavors and easy preparations, salsify's gentle subtlety seemed inadequate. Why bother with a vegetable that takes 14 months to mature when you could plant potatoes that are ready in 3 months? Why fuss with tedious peeling and careful preparation when you could just scrub a carrot and eat it raw? Why develop a taste for subtle, complex flavors when you could have something sweet and immediately appealing? These are reasonable questions, pragmatic questions. And they have reasonable, pragmatic answers. Because diversity is valuable. Because complexity enriches life. Because not everything worth having comes quickly or easily. Because the patience required to grow and prepare salsify cultivates patience in the grower and preparer, making them better suited for all the other work that requires patience. But these are not answers that translate well into
agricultural economics or modern food system.
They're philosophical answers, spiritual answers, answers that make sense within a monastic worldview, but seem quaint or impractical in the context of commercial agriculture and global food markets. And so salsify, like the other forgotten vegetables, gradually disappeared. Not overnight, the process took centuries. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, it was still common in kitchen gardens. Victorian gardeners still grew it, though already it was becoming unusual. By the 20th century, it was rare, persisting only in a few specialty catalogs and heritage gardens. Today you can still find it, if you look. Some seed companies offer it. Some restaurants serve it, usually as a novelty, a historical curiosity, an example of forgotten vegetables making a comeback. But it's not part of the common culinary vocabulary anymore. Most people have never tasted it, wouldn't recognize it, don't know what to do with it. What we've lost is not just salsify itself, the plant still exists. The seeds are available. You could grow it tomorrow if you wanted to. What we've lost is the context that made salsify meaningful. The patience that saw 14 months not as an inconvenience but as simply how long salsify takes. The attention that could appreciate subtle flavors without needing them to be bold. The relationship with food that understood eating as a complex practice involving history and season and community. Not just fuel intake. Brother Benedict finishes his harvest as the sun sets. Tomorrow, he'll harvest another bed, perhaps turnips, perhaps carrots. The garden keeps producing through autumn, each crop reaching maturity in its own time, each harvest bringing its own particular satisfactions. There's always work, but there's also always abundance. And the two seem inseparable. The abundance is the fruit of the work. The work is justified by the abundance. And both together create a life that feels meaningful, purposeful, connected to something larger than any individual. He returns his tools to the shed and walks to the chapel for vespers. His robes are dirty, his hands stained with soil, no amount of washing quite removes. His back slightly sore from a day of bending and digging. But there's satisfaction in the tiredness. Contentment in the knowledge of work well done. Peace in the rhythm of labor and prayer that structures every day. The salsify roots wait in the storage cellar, nestled in sand to keep them from drying out. They'll last for months this way, providing fresh vegetable matter through the winter when little else is available. Each time one is pulled from the sand, washed and prepared, it will carry with it the memory of that April day 14 months ago when Brother Benedict pressed the seeds into the soil. Not knowing whether he would be the one to harvest them, but trusting that someone would, that the work was worthwhile. That patience is its own reward. There is a plant that grows in the corner of the monastery garden. in a patch that has been undisturbed for longer than anyone can remember. It wasn't planted there last year, or the year before, or even 10 years ago. It has simply always been there, or so it seems, a permanent resident. A perennial companion that returns each spring without needing to be replanted, without demanding much attention, but faithfully producing year after year, decade after decade. This is good King Henry Cynopodium, Bonus Henricus in botanical Latin, though that scientific name wouldn't be invented for centuries yet. The monks know it by various common names: Mercury, Allgood, Poor Man's Asparagus, Lincolnshire Spinach. Its precise name matters less than its presence, its reliability, its generous productivity. It's early spring now, that tentative time when winter's grip is loosening, but hasn't fully released. When some days are mild and promising, and others bite with unexpected cold, most of the garden is still brown and bare, the soil too cold yet for planting. Most plants still dormant or barely stirring, but good King Henry doesn't wait for permission. From the crown of last year's plant, thick shoots are pushing up through the soil, pale green, or sometimes tinged with red, like about as thick as a man's finger, asparagus-like in appearance. These are the first fresh vegetables of spring, appearing even before the overwintered greens are ready to cut. Even before any other plant in the garden has shown signs of life. Sister and elderly now, her hands gnarled with decades of labor, her back permanently bent from years of garden work, walks slowly to the good King Henry patch with her knife and basket. This is her task every spring, and has been for 40 years or more. She knows these plants intimately, knows which crowns are oldest and most productive, knows exactly when the shoots are at their peak, knows how many shoots she can take from each plant without damaging its long-term health. She bends carefully. For bending is difficult now, and cuts the first shoot close to the ground. Clean, quick, the knife sharp enough that the shoot doesn't crush, but slices cleanly. The shoot goes in her basket. She moves to the next plant, selects another shoot, cuts. Slowly, methodically, she works her way through the patch, taking only the best shoots, leaving the smaller ones to grow and support the plant, ensuring that the harvest doesn't deplete the crowns that will need to produce leaves later in the season. This is sustainable harvesting, though Sister Anne wouldn't use that term. To her, it's simply common sense, the obvious way to treat plants that you depend on year after year. Take some, leave some. Use, but don't use up. Harvest, but don't destroy. These principles guide all the monastery's interactions with the natural world, principles born not from modern ecological theory, but from a practical necessity and from theological conviction that creation is God's gift, to be stewarded carefully, not exploited carelessly. The basket fills with shoots, perhaps 30. Not a large harvest, but enough for a meal, enough to provide that fresh green taste that everyone craves after months of stored food. Sister Anne straightens with effort and carries her basket to the kitchen. There, the cook greets her with the same nod he's given her on this same errand for years beyond counting. He takes the shoots and examines them with approval. Young, tender, exactly right. He'll prepare them simply as they deserve, boiled briefly in salted water until just tender, then served with butter and perhaps a grinding of pepper. This is the poor man's asparagus preparation, and it's apt the shoots taste remarkably like true asparagus, though perhaps slightly earthier, slightly more mineral in flavor. In a world where true asparagus is rare and expensive, these good King Henry shoots provide a similar experience, democratic and available, requiring no special soil or elaborate cultivation. But good King Henry offers more than just spring shoots. As the season progresses, those shoots that weren't harvested develop into leafy stems, and those leaves become the vegetable's second gift. They're substantial leaves, triangular, slightly succulent.
Oh.
A blue-green color with a powdery coating that makes them look frosted. They can be harvested continuously throughout the growing season, picked young for salads or allowed to mature for cooking. Cooked. They're prepared like spinach, boiled or steamed until tender, then squeezed dry and served with butter or oil. The flavor is mild, pleasant, slightly mineral. The texture is good, not slimy like some greens, not tough like others, but tender and yielding. They're nutritious too, high in iron and vitamins, exactly what's needed in a diet that often lacks diversity. Sister Anne no longer does the leaf harvesting. That task has passed to younger hands, as is right and proper. But she remembers decades of harvesting these leaves, preparing them, eating them. They're woven into her life so completely that she can hardly imagine a world without them. And yet, a world without them is coming, though she won't live to see it. Good King Henry, despite its virtues' perennial growth. Early spring shoots, continuous leaf production, tolerance of poor soil, minimal care required will gradually fall from favor and eventually become rare. The reasons are complex, overlapping. True spinach, as it was improved and became more widely available, offered similar leaves without the slight bitterness and mineral undertones of Good King Henry. True asparagus, as cultivation techniques improved, became less expensive and more accessible, reducing the appeal of substitutes. And Good King Henry has a drawback. Like spinach and chard, it contains oxalic acid, which in large quantities can interfere with calcium absorption and contribute to kidney stones. Medieval people wouldn't have known about oxalic acid, but they would have understood through experience that eating the same thing too often could cause problems. They naturally ate a varied diet, both because necessity and season forced variety, and because their agricultural system, its multitude of different crops, provided variety. In that context, Good King Henry was one green among many. Eaten regularly, but not exclusively, part of a rotation that prevented any one plant from dominating the diet. But as agricultural simplification proceeded, as fewer crops came to dominate more and more of the food supply, the minor drawbacks of plants like Good King Henry became magnified. Why grow something that required caution in consumption when you could grow something that could be eaten without restriction? Why maintain a patch of perennial vegetables when annual crops could be rotated and managed more flexibly? These are, again, reasonable questions with reasonable answers. The agricultural simplification that marginalized Good King Henry also fed growing populations more efficiently. Prevented famines allowed urban populations to expand. There were real benefits to focusing on a smaller number of highly productive, well-understood crops, but there were costs, two costs. We're still calculating, still discovering. The genetic diversity lost when thousands of crop varieties disappeared. The nutritional diversity lost when diets narrowed to a few staple foods. The cultural diversity lost when regional cuisines based on local crops gave way to globalized food systems. The resilience lost when agricultural systems became dependent on a small number of crops, vulnerable to crop-specific diseases and pests. And there's something else lost. Something harder to quantify, the relationship between people and plants that comes from long familiarity, from generational knowledge, from plants that persist in the same place over decades. Sister Anne knows the Good King Henry patch in a way that's impossible with annual crops that must be replanted each year. She knows its history, which crowns are oldest, which areas tend to produce best, how the patch has gradually expanded over the years. She has a relationship with these plants, and in some way, perhaps, they have a relationship with her. This kind of relationship, patient, attentive, extending over time's fundamentally different from the relationship between a farmer and an annual crop. The annual crop is planted, tended, harvested, and then it's gone. The relationship lasts a few months and then ends. But the perennial crop is always there, year after year. And the relationship deepens over time, becomes more nuanced, more intimate. There's a lesson here, perhaps, for how we live, not just how we garden, but how we live. In a world increasingly characterized by transience, by short-term thinking, by relationships and commitments that last only as long as they're immediately beneficial, there's something to be said for perennials, for things that persist, for commitments that extend beyond the immediate, for relationships that deepen over time rather than being constantly renewed or replaced. Good King Henry, growing in its corner of the garden, returning each spring without being asked, producing generously without demanding much. represents a different way of being, patient, persistent, reliable. It doesn't promise explosive growth or spectacular yields. It just keeps showing up, keeps producing, keeps fulfilling its role in the garden ecosystem and the monastery's food supply. Sister Anne returns to the Good King Henry patch in late summer to collect seeds. The plants have flowered, small, green, conspicuous flowers clustered along tall spikes. And now those flowers have matured into seeds. She strips the seed heads into a cloth sack, takes them to a shaded area to dry, and later winnows them to separate the seeds from the chaff. These seeds will be stored, some for potential planting if the monastery needs to establish new patches or share with other houses, but mostly as insurance. The Good King Henry patch reproduces itself adequately without human intervention. Established crowns persist for decades, and some self-seeding occurs naturally, but it's wise to have seeds stored anyway, just in case. Just in case disease strikes. Just in case animals damage the patch. Just in case. This is the prudence born of experience. The wisdom of communities that have survived for centuries by planning ahead. By maintaining redundancies, by never assuming that present abundance guarantees future sufficiency. It's a wisdom we could use more of today, as we build systems that are efficient but fragile, productive but vulnerable, optimized for the present at the cost of resilience for the future. The sun is setting now, and Sister Anne makes her way slowly toward the chapel for Vespers. Her basket is empty, the day's harvest long since prepared and eaten. The work complete until tomorrow brings new tasks. She's tired, but it's a good tiredness, the kind that comes from meaningful work completed. From participation in the rhythms that have structured her entire life, in the garden, the Good King Henry plants rest in the gathering darkness. Their leaves folded, their photosynthesis ceased until tomorrow's light. They'll be here tomorrow, and next week, and next year, and for years after Sister Anne is gone. That's the promise of perennials. They outlast individuals. Connecting generations, providing continuity in a world of constant change. And in that continuity, there is comfort. There is meaning. There is a sense of being part of something larger than oneself. Something that began before you and will continue after you. Something to which you contribute, but which doesn't depend entirely on you. This is what the garden teaches. Perhaps its deepest lesson. We are custodians, not owners. Stewards, not masters. We participate in cycles that we didn't create and can't control. And our task, our joy, our callings to tend these cycles carefully, to pass them on intact to those who come after. To be faithful in small things, because the small things accumulated over time become the great things that sustain communities and civilizations. The bell rings. Evening prayer begins. And the garden sleeps, waiting for tomorrow's sun, tomorrow's work, tomorrow's harvest. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will, as long as someone remains to tend it, to care for it, to remember in the scriptorium. A monk sits at his desk, quill in hand, parchment before him. The light streaming through the tall, narrow window is perfect for this work, bright enough to see clearly, but not so bright as to cause glare on the pale parchment. He dips his quill into the ink pot, ink made from oak galls and iron salts, mixed with gum arabic to bind it. A recipe as old as learning itself, and carefully forms the next letter. He is copying an herbal, a book of plants and their properties. The original from which he works is itself a copy, made perhaps a century ago from an earlier manuscript, which was copied from one earlier still, in a chain of transmission stretching back through the centuries. Some of the information in this herbal ultimately derives from the ancient Greek physician Dioscorides, who wrote his Materia Medica in the 1st century AD. Some comes from Pliny the Elder's natural history. Some from the Roman agricultural writers. And some has been added by generations of monks, recording their own observations, their own discoveries, their own regional variations on the ancient knowledge. The page he's working on now describes Caesar Skirit. The text is in Latin, dense with abbreviations that save precious parchment. He copies mechanically, his mind half engaged with the meaning, half lost in the meditative flow of the work itself. The letters march across the page in neat columns, each one carefully formed, the spacing even. The lines rulers straight. But this monk, Brother Paul, let us call him, is not merely a scribe. He's also the monastery's herbalist and gardener, responsible for both the physic garden, where medicinal plants grow, and the vegetable gardens that feed the community. So when he copies this description of Skirit, he's not just transcribing words. He's engaging with knowledge he possesses in his body and his hands. In his experience, the text describes Skirit's roots, their sweet tastes, their use in foods and medicines. Brother Paul knows this, not from books, but from years of growing Skirit, harvesting its roots, preparing them, eating them. As he copies, he mentally checks the text against his experience. Is this accurate? Does this match what he's observed? Where the text says thrives in moist soil, he nods yes. The Skirit bed near the fish pond always produces better than the one in drier ground. Where it says roots are sweetest after frost, he nods again. Absolutely true. He's tasted the difference. But here, where the text says the leaves can be eaten like other pot herbs, he pauses. In his experience, Skirit leaves are too bitter, too fibrous to eat. Perhaps the ancient author was describing a different variety, or perhaps he was simply wrong. Ancient authorities, despite the reverence accorded them, were not infallible. Brother Paul makes a small mark in the margin of his copia nota bene. A note, well, later, if there's space, he might add a marginal gloss recording his own observation. In our garden, the leaves are too bitter for eating. This is how knowledge accumulates, how texts become living documents rather than dead letters. A generation of scribes adds their own observations, corrections and amplifications, creating manuscripts that are collaborations across centuries. The work is slow. A full herbal might take a year or more to copy, and that's if the scribe works on it consistently, which Brother Paul cannot do. He has other duties, other responsibilities. The garden needs tending. Patients need treatment. The regular schedule of prayers must be observed. The manuscript work fits into the gaps and margins of life, progressing gradually, patiently, across the scriptorium. Another monk is working on a different kind of manuscript, a cookbook, recording recipes used in the monastery kitchen. This too is slow work, complicated by the nature of medieval recipes, which rarely specify quantities or cooking times with precision. Take Skirit roots, one recipe reads, and boil them in water until tender. Peel them and dress with butter and sugar or honey. Serve hot. How many roots? How much water? How long is until tender? These details are assumed knowledge, things that any cook would know from experience. The recipes are memory aids, not instruction manuals. They're meant for people who already know how to cook, who just need reminding of which ingredients go together, what steps to follow. This understanding of knowledge is something embodied, experiential, learned through apprenticeship and practice rather than through written instruction. Permeates medieval life. Books are important, yes, but they're supplements to experience, not replacements for it. You don't learn to garden from herbals. You learn by gardening and then use herbals to supplement and deepen what you already know. This is why the loss of plants like Skirit matters more than we might initially think. It's not just that we've lost access to Skirit, the plant we could, in theory, get seeds and grow it again. It's that we've lost the accumulated knowledge of how to grow it well, how to prepare it, how to use it, what dishes it fits into, what flavors complement it. We've lost the embodied knowledge, the experiential understanding, the craft knowledge that can't be fully captured in words. Think about your own skills cooking, perhaps, or some craft or art. You could write down instructions for what you do. But would those instructions fully convey your expertise? Would someone following them achieve the same results? Probably not. There's something in the doing, in the repetition, in the feedback between action and result. Can't be reduced to text. This is what was lost when the chain of transmission was broken. When the continuous practice of growing and preparing these vegetables ended, the texts survive. We have medieval herbals and cookbooks in libraries and archives. But the tacit knowledge, the embodied expertise, the subtle understanding that came from daily practice, that's gone. we can revive the plants. But reviving the knowledge is much harder. Brother Paul finishes the page he's working on and carefully blots it to set the ink. Tomorrow, he'll continue, and the next day, and the day after, until the manuscript is complete. When it's done, it will be a treasure, not just because of the countless hours of skilled labor it represents, but because of the knowledge it contains. Knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Medieval monasteries were, among other things, memory institutions. In a world where literacy was rare, where books were expensive and fragile, where political instability and violence could destroy entire libraries in a day, the monasteries served as preservers of knowledge. They copied manuscripts. They maintained libraries. They transmitted ancient learning to future generations. And crucially, they didn't just preserve textual knowledge, they preserved practical knowledge through continuous practice. They kept growing the plants described in ancient herbals, kept preparing the recipes recorded in old cookbooks, kept practicing the agricultural techniques described in Roman manuals. The knowledge stayed alive because it was continuously embodied, enacted, practiced. This is a model we've largely lost. Our knowledge preservation is almost entirely textual or digital, which is just textual in a different medium. We assume that if something is written down, it's preserved. But is it? Can you learn to garden from a book alone? Can you learn to cook, to build, to heal? Text can guide, can remind, and supplement, but it can't replace embodied. Practiced when monastic life was disrupted through the Protestant Reformation, through the dissolution of the monasteries, through the general secularization and modernization of European society, one of the losses was this embodied institutional knowledge. The books survived in many cases, but the practices didn't, at least not in their full complexity and depth. Brother Paul doesn't think about these things as he works. He's not worried about preserving knowledge for a future that might see monasticism decline. He's simply doing his work, fulfilling his duties, serving his community. The manuscript he's copying will, he assumes, be used by future monks in this monastery, and perhaps copies will be made for other houses. Spreading the knowledge throughout the monastic network, he can't imagine a world where there are no monasteries, or only a few, or where they've become museums rather than living communities. He can't imagine a world where the plants he knows so intimately have become rare curiosities. His present seems solid, permanent. It's continuous with the past and extending into the future. But we, looking back across the centuries, know differently. We know that the world Brother Paul inhabits is fragile. The continuity he takes for granted will be broken, that much of what he knows will be lost. In knowing this, we can see his work differently, not just as routine copying, but as an act of preservation, a gift passed forward to a future he cannot envision, but which will be grateful for what he has saved. The afternoon light is fading. Brother Paul cleans his quill, caps his ink, and carefully places his manuscript in the chest where works in progress are stored. Tomorrow he'll return and continue. The garden will need his attention too. There's always work in the garden, tasks that can't be postponed for long. But the manuscript will progress steadily, patiently, one page at a time, until it's complete, and then it will take its place in the library. Alongside other manuscripts copied by other monks year after year, century after century, a library not just of texts, but of lives, of labor, of dedication. A library that says, this matters. This is worth saving. This should not be forgotten. If only we had listened. If only we had understood what we were losing. But we didn't, and much was lost. Not everything. Some manuscripts survived, some knowledge was preserved, some plants persisted. But enough was lost that we now must excavate our own history, must rediscover what our ancestors knew, must try to revive practices that were once so commonplace they barely seemed worth recording. This is the irony of progress. In racing toward the future, we often abandon valuable parts of the past, only to later realize we need them and must painstakingly reconstruct what could have been maintained with minimal effort. The vegetables, the recipes, the knowledge all could have continued. Instead, they must be resurrected, incompletely and with great difficulty. But for now, in this scriptorium, in this monastery, the work continues. The knowledge lives. The plants grow. And Brother Paul's careful hand preserves on parchment what centuries of practice have proven true. The year turns. As it always does, marked not by calendar dates, but by the garden's transformations. In the monastery, time is measured differently than in the world beyond the walls. There are the hours of prayer matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, oplentizing each day into sacred segments. There are the feast days and fast days, the holy days that structure the church calendar. And there is the garden's calendar. Older than Christianity, ancient as agriculture itself, the eternal cycle of planting and growth. Harvest and rest. Stand with me now at the edge of the garden in earliest spring, late February, perhaps or early March. The world is still caught between winter and the coming warmth. The sky is that particular pale gray that speaks of cold, though the harshest frosts are past. The soil, if you kneel and press your hand against it, is still cold, still too cold for most planting. But there are signs, if you know how to read them. The days are perceptibly longer now. The sun, though weak, climbs higher in the sky each day. And in the sheltered spots, against the south-facing wall, the corners protected from wind, the first brave shoots are appearing. The good King Henry, faithful as always, is already pushing up its thick asparagus-like stems. The winter purslane, which has provided greens even through the coldest months, suddenly vigorous, taking advantage of the lengthening days. And if you dig carefully at the edge of the rampion bed, you'll find that the roots are swelling, preparing for the growth explosion to come. This is the time of Lent in the church. Calendar 40 days of fasting and abstinence before Easter. For the monks already restricted in their diet year-round, Lent means even stricter discipline. No eggs, no cheese, no butter, nothing from animals except fish on certain days. The diet becomes almost entirely plant-based. And the monks depend heavily on whatever the garden can provide. Early spring is a hungry time. The stores from last year's harvest are depleted, the best has been eaten. What remains are the inferior roots, the sprouting onions, the turnips going soft in storage. The new crops haven't matured yet. There's a gap, a lean period between the old year's abundance and the new year's promise. It's in this gap that the value of plants like Good King becomes clear, that early spring harvest of tender shoots is not luxury but necessity. Not treat, but sustenance. Brother James, yes, we need another name. Another person to carry us through this story walks the garden paths in late March, assessing what's ready. What's nearly ready? What will need more time? He's young still, only 10 years in the monastery, but he's learned well from the older brothers. He knows the plants, knows their rhythms, knows what to expect from each season. Here, the overwintered kale is ready for cutting. The leaves are tender now, before the plant bolts to flower. Here, the sorrel is producing vigorously, its sharp, lemony leaves perfect for cutting the heaviness of bean pottage. Here, the first of the spring-planted lettuce is germinating. Tiny green cotyledons, pushing up in neat rows, though it will be weeks before they're large enough to harvest. He makes mental notes of what the kitchen will have available this week, next week, the week after. Planning is essential. Plant too little, and the community goes hungry. Plant too much and food is wasted, a sin when so many beyond the walls are in need. The garden must provide sufficiency without excess, abundance without waste. By April, the garden is transforming rapidly. The spring planting is in full swing, no beans and peas pressed into warming soil. Onion sets pushed firmly into place, brassicas transplanted from their seed beds. The fruit trees in the orchard are in glorious bloom, clouds of white and pink that fill the air with fragrance and attract clouds of bees from the monastery's hives. And the early vegetables are producing abundantly more greens than the community can eat fresh. So some are being dried for later use. Preserved against future need, May brings the first real warmth, and with it, explosive growth. The garden seems to green overnight, every bed filled with thriving plants. The early peas are climbing their supports, their tendrils curling and grasping. The beans are pushing up through the soil, unfolding their first true leaves. The Alexander's, now in its second year, sends up thick stems that must be harvested quickly, before they become too tough. And everywhere in the vegetable beds, along the paths. In the herb garden, flowers are blooming, turning the utilitarian garden into something beautiful, something that feeds the soul as well as the body. This is when Brother James understands most deeply why the rule of Saint Benedict emphasizes the importance of manual labor. Working in the garden in May, surrounded by life and growth and beauty, hands in the soil, sun warm on his back, this is not drudgery, but gift. This is participation in creation itself. Cooperation with the divine impulse that makes seeds sprout and leaves unfurl and flowers bloom. He could be praying in the chapel, yes, but in a very real sense. He is praying with his hands, with his attention, with his care for these living things that God has placed in his stewardship. June and July are the garden's peak months. Its moment of greatest abundance. Everything is producing now lettuces and radishes and turnips in succession plantings. Beans climbing ever higher, peas heavy with pods, the first carrots ready for pulling. The kitchen brothers are overwhelmed with plenty, using everything they can fresh, preserving what they can't. Herbs are being harvested and dried in great bunches. Peas and beans are being dried for winter storage. And still, the garden produces. Its generosity almost overwhelming. But there's work too. Endless work. The same warm, wet conditions that make everything grow also make the weeds grow. Every bed needs weeding constantly. The climbing beans need their poles secured as the weight of plants and pods threatens to pull them down. The brassicas need protection from caterpillars that can strip a plant to bare stems overnight. Slugs feast on the lettuces unless vigilantly removed. There is no rest in summer. Only the constant round of tasks that keep the garden productive. August brings a shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The light changes, becoming richer, more golden, slanting at a different angle. The days, though still warm, are perceptibly shorter, and the garden's focus shifts from leafy growth to seed and fruit production. The beans are producing fewer flowers and more pods. The grain crops in the fields beyond the garden, barley and oats and rye, are turning golden, nearly ready for harvest. And in the vegetable garden, plants that grew vigorously all summer are now channeling their energy into reproduction, into seeds for next year. This is when Brother James and the other gardeners begin the crucial work of seed saving. They walk through the garden with a discerning eye, marking the best plants, the most vigorous, the most productive, the best tasting, the most true to type. These plants will be allowed to flower and set seed. The rest will be harvested for eating while still in their prime. The marked plants stand in the garden like honored elders, allowed to complete their full life cycle while their neighbors are cut down in their prime. The Alexanders send up tall stalks crowned with yellow-green umbels. The Skirt produces white, lacy flowers. The good King Henry develops tall spikes of tiny green blossoms, and the monks wait patiently for these flowers to mature into seeds, for the seeds to ripen. For the moment when they can be collected and stored for next year's planting, September is harvest month, the culmination of the year's labor. The garden is at its peak of productivity, root vegetables swelling in the ground. Late-season greens thriving in the cooler weather, pods and seeds ready for collection. The monks work long hours, bringing in the harvest before frost can damage it, filling the storerooms and cellars, laying up provision for the winter to come. There's a particular satisfaction to this work, a sense of completion. Seeds planted in spring have become plants. Plants have produced food and more seeds, and the cycle is complete. The monastery is secure for another winter, the barns and cellars full, the community provided for. It's the work of many hands over many months. But it's also something more. It's proof that the system works, that the ancient partnership between humans and plants continues to sustain life, that trust in the pattern of the seasons is rewarded. October brings the first frosts, not the killing frosts of deep winter, but warning frosts, reminders that the growing season is ending. The tender plants, beans, squash, any lingering annuals are blackened and killed, but the hardy plants remain, the kale and other brassicas, which actually improve with frost. The leeks, which will stand in the frozen ground all winter, ready to be dug whenever they're needed. The good King Henry, which dies back to its roots, but will return next spring. And various root vegetables that can be left in the ground under mulch and harvested as needed, the garden takes on a different character now. The lush fullness of summer is gone, replaced by a spare, austere beauty. The bones of the garden are visible, the layout of beds and paths, the structure that was hidden under summer's abundance. It's quieter, too fewer insects, fewer birds. Only the sound of wind and the occasional call of crows. Brother James and the other gardeners are preparing the garden for winter, spreading manure and compost on beds that will rest until spring, digging over others to expose soil to winter's freezing and thawing, which helps break up clods and kill pests, cleaning and storing tools, repairing fences and walls damaged during the busy growing season. It's still work, but different work: tidying, maintaining, preparing rather than the urgent planting and harvesting of other seasons. November is stark. The trees are bare now, their leaves fallen and composted, or spread as mulch. The perennial plants have died back to their roots. The annual plants are gone entirely, their places bare soil waiting for next year's seeds. The garden sleeps, or seems to. Though beneath the surface, roots are still alive, drawing nutrients, storing energy, waiting. The kitchen now relies entirely on stored food: the roots in the cellar, the dried beans and grains, the preserved vegetables, the dried herbs. The meals are simpler than summer's abundance, but they're sufficient. And there's a rightness to this austerity, this stripping away of excess. Winter is a time for contemplation, for turning inward. It's for focusing on essentials. December brings the darkest days, the longest nights. The winter solstice, though the monks would frame it as the feast of Christmas, marks the turning point. After this, slowly, imperceptibly at first, the days will begin to lengthen. Light is returning. Spring is coming, though it's still months away. January and February are winter's depths. Cold. It's often snowy. Everything frozen and still. The garden is invisible under snow, or gray and dormant when the snow melts. Only the evergreen herbs show any green: the rosemary, the sage. The time that the monks brush past on their way to the chapel, releasing brief puffs of fragrance into the cold air. But even now, invisible to casual observation, things are happening. The garlic cloves planted in autumn are developing roots beneath the frozen soil. The seeds of plants that require winter cold to germinate properly are undergoing the necessary stratification. And the perennial plant, the good King Henry, the rampion, the established Alexander Tsar, resting. Yes, but also preparing their crowns, developing the nascent shoots that will push up when warmth returns. Brother James, walking the frozen paths in February, sees only dormancy. But he knows what he cannot see, that beneath the seeming death, life persists. That the garden is not ended but paused. That spring will come, as it always comes, and the cycle will begin again. And this knowledge, this deep, embodied understanding of cycles, of death and resurrection, of patient waiting rewarded, this is perhaps the garden's greatest gift. Not the food it produces, important as that is, but the wisdom it teaches, that life continues, that patience is rewarded, that trust in the pattern is not naive but realistic, that the cycle endures. The seasons turn. They always do. Winter gives way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring again. Nothing is permanent except the pattern itself, the great wheel that turns regardless of human wishes or fears. And in that pattern, there is comfort. There is meaning. There is a sense of being part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, brother. James returns to the warmth of the monastery buildings as evening falls. Tomorrow, the cycle continues. Prayers and work, work and prayers, the rhythm that structures every day. And beyond tomorrow, the seasons will continue to turn, carrying the garden and the monks and all of life along with them. In the pattern that was old when humans first pressed seeds into soil and is still new with every spring's greening, there is a moment difficult to pinpoint precisely, stretching perhaps over decades or even centuries, but a moment nonetheless when something shifts. When what was common becomes unusual, when what was prized becomes forgotten. What everyone knew becomes a curiosity known only to specialists. This moment came for our forgotten vegetables, though it came at different times and for different reasons for each one. Imagine a monastery in the late 16th century, the 1580s. Perhaps the garden still grows many of the plants we've been exploring. Skirit. Alexander's, Salsify, good King Henry. The monks still tend them, harvest them, eat them, save their seeds. The tradition continues, though the world beyond the monastery walls is changing in ways that will eventually transform everything. The age of exploration is well underway. Columbus has sailed. The Portuguese have reached India. Spanish galleons are crossing the Pacific. And with these voyages comes an exchange of plants that will reshape agriculture across the entire world. The Americas, that new world, which was, of course, very old to its inhabitants, are yielding up their botanical treasures to European cultivation. And these new plants are about to revolutionize European gardens and European tables. Consider the potato. Native to the Andes, cultivated by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. It arrived in Europe in the mid-16th century. At first it was a curiosity, a novelty, grown in botanical gardens and wealthy collectors' estates. But gradually, its virtues became apparent. It produced astonishing yields, far more calories per acre than grain crops. It grew in poor soil. It tolerated cool, wet climates. It stored well. And it was reasonably nutritious. Particularly when eaten with the skins on, by the 17th century, potatoes were spreading across northern Europe. By the 18th, they were becoming a staple crop. And as they did, they began to displace older vegetables, including skirit. Why grow skirit, with its delicate roots that required careful digging and didn't store as well, when you could grow potatoes that you practically harvested with your hands, that stored for months in a cool cellar with minimal care, that produced vastly more food per acre? From a purely practical standpoint, the choice was obvious. Potatoes were simply more efficient. They fed more people with less labor. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, where crop failures meant starvation, where populations were growing and every acre of productive land was precious, efficiency mattered. The potato saved lives, prevented famines, made it possible to feed larger populations. But something was lost in this exchange. The flavor of skirit, complex and subtle, was lost. The varieties that had been selected over centuries, adapted to particular regions and soils, were lost. The knowledge of how to grow it well, harvest it properly, prepare it deliciously, this knowledge, maintained through continuous practice, began to fade. Or consider tomatoes, another New World import. They arrived in Europe in the 16th century and were initially viewed with suspicion. They're members of the nightshade family, and Europeans rightly recognized that many nightshades are poisonous. But gradually, particularly in southern Europe, tomatoes became accepted and then beloved. By the 18th century, tomatoes were central to Italian cuisine. By the 19th, they were spreading northward, and as tomatoes became common, other vegetables seemed less interesting by comparison. Alexander's, with its complex but somewhat medicinal flavor, couldn't compete with the sweet acidity of tomatoes. Why bother with Alexander's when you could have tomatoes, which were easier to grow, produced more abundantly, and had a flavor that most people found more immediately appealing? Again, the choice seems rational, but again, something was lost, not just a plant, but a whole constellation of knowledge, tradition, in relationship with that plant. The story repeats with other New World crops. Peppers, both sweet and hot, offered flavors and possibilities that European vegetables couldn't match. Beans, from the Americas, runner beans, kidney beans. Lima beans produced better yields than most traditional European varieties. Squash and pumpkins thrived in European gardens and provided abundant food. Corn, though it never became central to European cuisine the way it did in the Americas, still found its place. Each of these crops had virtues often genuine, significant virtues that made them worth adopting. But their adoption came at a cost. The older crops they displaced gradually disappeared from cultivation, and with them disappeared centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition. And it wasn't only New World crops that caused this displacement. European vegetables themselves were being transformed through intensive selection and breeding. Carrots, once variable in color and shape, were standardized into the familiar orange taproots we know today. Cabbage was developed into cauliflower, broccoli, kohlrabi, and numerous other forms. Lettuce diversified into dozens of varieties. Beets were bred both for their roots and for their leaves charred. These improvements were real. The new varieties often did taste better, grow more reliably, produce more abundantly than their predecessors, but they also created a kind of agricultural narrowing. Instead of dozens of different vegetables each filling a particular niche, a smaller number of highly developed vegetables came to dominate. Salsify provides a clear example. As carrots and parsnips were improved, as their cultivation became more sophisticated and widespread, salsify's unique flavors seemed less necessary. Why grow 3 similar root vegetables when you could grow 2 excellent ones? Salsify being the least common of the 3. The most difficult to prepare and the most unusual in flavor was the obvious candidate for elimination: Good King. Henry fell victim to a different pressure: agricultural intensification. As farming became more commercial, as market gardens developed to feed growing cities, perennial vegetables became problematic. A bed of Good King Henry, once established, occupied its space for years or decades. But commercial market gardeners wanted flexibility, the ability to rotate crops, to plant whatever would sell best that season, to respond quickly to market demands. Annual vegetables fit this model perfectly. You could plant spinach in early spring, harvest it, and then plant something else in the same space. But Good King Henry, sitting in its bed year after year, represented lost opportunity space that could be used for more profitable crops. And so, despite its virtues, Good King Henry gradually disappeared from commercial cultivation, persisting only in a few cottage gardens where efficiency was less important than tradition. Alexander's faced competition from improved celery. Wild celery is barely edible, tough, bitter, more medicinal herb than vegetable. But through centuries of selection, primarily by Italian gardeners, celery was transformed into something delicious. Crisp, juicy stems with a distinctive but not overwhelming flavor. And celery had an advantage over Alexander's. It could be blanched, grown with soil mounded around it to exclude light, which made the stems even milder and more tender. By the 18th century, celery cultivation had become sophisticated, with specialized techniques for blanching and long-season varieties that could be harvested well into winter. Alexander's, with its limited harvest window and strong flavor that couldn't be modified, simply couldn't compete. Why bother with Alexander's when celery was available, often year-round, from market gardens that had mastered season extension techniques? But it wasn't only practical considerations that drove these changes. Taste was changing to cultural shifts in what people found appealing, in what flavors were fashionable, in how food was prepared and consumed. Medieval and Renaissance cuisine favored complex, sometimes challenging flavors. Bitter, sour, and pungent tastes were appreciated, not avoided. Spices were used abundantly, not to mask spoiled food as is sometimes claimed, but because that's what people enjoyed. Food was highly seasoned, intensely flavored, boldly spiced, but beginning in the 17th century and accelerating in the 18th and 19th, European taste began to shift. There was a movement toward natural flavors, toward letting ingredients speak for themselves rather than drowning them in spices and strong seasonings. This shift was partly philosophical, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about nature and naturalness, and partly practical as sugar became cheaper and more available. European palates shifted toward sweeter flavors in this new taste regime. Vegetables like Good King Henry and Alexander's, with their slightly bitter or medicinal undertones, seemed old-fashioned, peasant-like, unsophisticated. Newer vegetables, or newly developed varieties with milder, sweeter flavors, were more in line with emerging preferences. Carrots became sweeter, peas became sweeter. Even vegetables like lettuce were selected for mildness rather than the pleasant bitterness of earlier varieties. This was a genuine shift in aesthetic preference, not simply a matter of right or wrong. Tastes change across cultures and across time. But the effect on our forgotten vegetables was significant. They were caught on the wrong side of a taste. Revolution, and many people simply stopped wanting to eat them. There were economic factors too. As Europe industrialized, as population shifted from rural areas to cities. As agriculture became more commercialized, the food system changed fundamentally. Subsistence farming growing what you needed to feed, your family gave way to market farming growing what would sell for the best price. And in a market system, vegetables that were unusual, that required special knowledge to prepare, that had acquired flavors rather than mild sweetness, were at a disadvantage. City dwellers, often only a generation or two removed from rural life, might not have the knowledge to prepare vegetables like salsify or skirret. Market vendors wanted to sell vegetables that customers recognized and knew how to use. And so the range of vegetables in urban markets narrowed to the most common, most familiar varieties. The monasteries themselves, those institutions that had preserved so much agricultural knowledge, were declining. The Protestant Reformation had dissolved monasteries across Northern Europe. Even in Catholic regions, the Enlightenment brought secularization and declining religious vocations. Many monasteries closed or saw their communities dwindle. Then went centuries of accumulated gardening expertise. The monks who had known exactly when to harvest skirret for peak sweetness, who could judge by eye and touch when salsify was ready, who understood the nuances of each vegetable they grew. These men were not replaced. Their gardens were either abandoned or taken over by people with less specialized knowledge. And without that continuous tradition of practice, knowledge was lost. By the 19th century, the process was well advanced. Cookbooks from the period show the shift clearly. Recipes for skirret and Alexanders become rare, then vanish entirely. Agricultural manuals stop mentioning them. Seed catalogs drop them from their listings. The vegetables haven't yet disappeared entirely, but they're becoming antiquarian curiosities. Things your grandmother might have grown, plants that old-fashioned country people still cultivated, but which modern progressive gardeners saw no reason to bother with. And then came the 20th century, with its industrial agriculture, its global food system, supermarket distribution model. These developments brought real benefits. Food became cheaper, more reliable, more available. Famines that would once have killed thousands were averted through efficient distribution systems. People who previously spent most of their income on food could afford other goods. But the cost, in terms of agricultural diversity, was enormous. Supermarkets wanted vegetables that looked perfect, stored well, shipped without damage, and were available year-round. This meant a radical narrowing of varieties from thousands of different cultivars of each vegetable to a handful of commercial varieties selected for shipping quality and shelf life rather than flavor or nutrition, and vegetables that didn't fit this model at all, that were too delicate, too variable, too regionally specific, too unusual, simply disappeared from the commercial food system. You couldn't buy skirret or Alexanders or salsify at the supermarket because the supermarket had no place for them, no way to handle them, no customers who would recognize them. The great-grandchildren of the monks who had grown these vegetables in monastery gardens had probably never heard of them. The great-grandchildren of the peasants who had grown them in cottage gardens had moved to cities, worked in factories, bought their vegetables at shops, and had no memory of the plants their ancestors had depended on. This is how forgetting happens, not through dramatic destruction, not through deliberate elimination, but through gradual displacement. Through each generation making reasonable choices that favor efficiency and convenience. Through the slow erosion of tradition and the breaking of chains of transmission that had persisted for centuries. And now, here we are in the 21st century, looking back at what was lost and wondering, could we recover it? Should we try? What would it mean to bring back these forgotten vegetables, not just as historical curiosities, but as living parts of our food system again? These are questions we'll explore further. But for now, as the light fades and evening settles over the garden, let us acknowledge what was lost. Not with bitterness, history moves forward, and many of the changes that displaced these vegetables brought genuine benefits, but with a sense of what poet John Milton called sober sorrow, An awareness that progress and loss are not opposites, but often twins. That every gain involves some sacrifice, and that in our rush toward the future, we sometimes abandon valuable things from the past that we later wish we had kept. The garden is empty now, at least in our imagination. The skirret beds are planted with potatoes. The Alexander's patch has been replaced by celery. The good King Henry corner grows annual spinach replanted each year. And the monks who once tended these forgotten plants are themselves forgotten, their names lost, their faces unknown, their lives reduced to the faintest traces in historical records. But the seeds remain. In seed banks, in a few specialized collections, in the gardens of eccentric enthusiasts who grow forgotten vegetables for love of history or diversity, or simply because they're interested in trying something different. The seeds remain dormant but not dead, waiting like sleeping potential for someone to plant them, to revive the tradition, to remember what has been forgotten. There is a seed bank in Norway, built into the side of a mountain on the remote island of Svalbard, deep in the Arctic. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, they call it humanity's backup plan, a repository for seeds of crop plants from around the world, stored at sub-zero temperatures in case of global catastrophe. It's a fortress against forgetting, a defense against the loss of genetic diversity that has characterized modern agriculture. In that frozen vault, in sealed packets carefully labeled and cataloged, are seeds of vegetables you've never heard of, including, quite possibly, seeds of skirret, Alexander's, salsify. Good King Henry Hour, forgotten vegetables, preserved not as living tradition, but as frozen potential, sleeping in the cold darkness, waiting. This is both hopeful and melancholy. Hopeful because the plants haven't been permanently lost, the genetic material exists, could be planted, could grow again. But melancholy because seeds in a vault, however carefully preserved, are not the same as seeds in soil, not the same as living plants in gardens, not the same as continuous tradition connecting past to present to future. A seed in storage is a pause, a suspension. Its possibility held in abeyance. But it's not life, not yet. Not until someone takes it from storage, plants it, tends it, allows it to grow and flower and produce more seeds. Till then, it's just potential, frozen and waiting. This tension between preservation and living tradition is central to understanding what was lost when our forgotten vegetables faded from cultivation. We haven't lost them completely. The genetic material mostly exists in seed banks or in the gardens of enthusiasts who maintain small populations. But we have lost the accumulated knowledge, the embedded expertise, continuous tradition of growing and using these plants. Think about it this way. Imagine a language that's no longer spoken, that exists only in written texts and academic study. The language isn't completely lost. Scholars can read the texts, can puzzle out grammar and vocabulary, can even teach others to read and write in it. But is that the same as a living language, spoken daily, evolving naturally, embedded in a living culture? Clearly not. Something essential is missing: the lived experience, the natural fluency, the unconscious competence that comes only from daily use. Our forgotten vegetables are like that. The seeds exist. Written descriptions exist in herbals, in cookbooks, in agricultural manuals. But the living tradition, the embodied knowledge of exactly when to plant, how to recognize when roots are ready to harvest, what dishes to prepare, what flavors complement, what much of that is gone, or at least severely degraded. But seeds are patient. This is one of their remarkable qualities: they can wait. Some seeds remain viable for only a year or two, needing to be replanted frequently to maintain the variety. But others can survive for decades or even centuries, dormant but not dead, ready to germinate when conditions are right. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, but scientifically plausible, for some species of seeds found in ancient tombs that germinated after thousands of years. Of lotus seeds from a dry lake bed in China sprouting after 1,300 years. Of date palm seeds from the fortress of Masada germinating after 2,000 years. Even if these specific stories are exaggerated or misidentified, they point to a real phenomenon: seeds' remarkable ability to persist, to wait, to preserve life. In suspended animation, until the moment is right for growth. This quality makes seeds a perfect metaphor for memory, for tradition, for knowledge, waiting to be rediscovered. The forgotten vegetables are like seeds buried in the soil of history, dormant, visible, apparently lost but not actually gone. They wait for the right conditions, for someone to dig them up, to recognize their value, to plant them once again. And this is, in fact, happening. Beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 21st. There has been a revival of interest in heirloom vegetables, in agricultural diversity, in forgotten crops. The modern seed-saving movement, heritage seed companies, organizations like Slow Food and the Seed Savers Exchange, these represent a collective effort to recover what was lost, to revive the dormant seeds, to restore some of the diversity that was sacrificed in the rush toward agricultural efficiency. You can now, if you look hard enough, find seeds of Skirit, Alexander's Salsify, Good King Henry. Specialized seed companies offer them, usually with notes about their historical significance and advice on cultivation. Enthusiastic gardeners grow them, experiment with them, share them with others. Restaurants interested in unusual ingredients occasionally feature them on menus. They're being rediscovered, remembered, brought back from the edge of extinction. And this is important, they're being rediscovered in a different context, with different meanings. A modern gardener growing Skirit is doing something fundamentally different from what Brother Thomas did in that medieval monastery garden. Brother Thomas was maintaining a living tradition, part of a continuous chain stretching back centuries. The modern gardener is attempting to revive a broken tradition, to reconstruct something that was lost. This doesn't make the modern effort less valuable. In many ways, it's more difficult, and therefore more admirable, harder to resurrect than to maintain, harder to remember than to never forget. But it is different. The living tradition, the embedded knowledge, the cultural context, these can't be fully recovered, only approximated or reinvented. Think of the seeds themselves, waiting in their packets or frozen in their vaults. They contain, in their genetic code, instructions for building a Skirit plant, an Alexander's plant, a Salsify plant. But they don't contain instructions for how to grow these plants well, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, what to eat them with. That knowledge exists separately in texts if we're lucky, or not at all. Lost when the last person who knew it died without passing it on. So the modern revival is partly recovery and partly invention. We're growing the same plants genetically, they're largely unchanged, but we're growing them in different contexts, with different knowledge for different purposes. A medieval monk grew Skirit to feed his community, following methods he learned from older monks, preparing it in ways prescribed by centuries of tradition. A modern gardener grows Skirit out of curiosity, or historical interest, or desire for diversity. Following instructions from books or websites, preparing it experimentally because there's no living tradition to guide the process. Both are valid. Both matter. But they're not the same thing. And recognizing the difference helps us understand what was lost, what can or can't be recovered. There's a deeper metaphor here too, about memory itself. Human memory, like seeds, can lie dormant and then be revived. Things we think we've forgotten can suddenly resurface, triggered by a scent, a sound, a taste, a place. The memories were there all along, buried but not gone, waiting for the right stimulus to bring them back to consciousness. And collective memory, historical memory, works similarly. Things a society has forgotten can be remembered, brought back into awareness through historical research, archaeological discovery, renewed interest. The past isn't gone. It's still present, layered beneath the surface of the now, accessible to those who dig deep enough. But there's also a question. Should everything be remembered? Is it possible, or even desirable, to maintain every tradition, preserve every variety, remember everything? Change is not only inevitable, but often positive. Some things are worth forgetting or moving beyond. The challenge is discernment, distinguishing between what should be remembered and what can acceptably be forgotten, between diversity worth preserving and complexity that serves no real purpose. For our forgotten vegetables, the case for remembering seems strong. The genetic diversity they represent could be valuable. As climate changes and agriculture needs crops adapted to new conditions, the flavors and nutrition they offer add to human experience, to the richness of cuisine and culture, and the knowledge embedded in their cultivation about sustainable agriculture, about patient observation, about working with rather than against natural processes, increasingly relevant. As we grapple with the environmental costs of industrial farming, but the argument cuts both ways. Should we really try to maintain thousands of crop varieties when a few hundred, carefully selected and well adapted, could feed humanity more efficiently? Should we preserve vegetables that most people find unpalatable or too much trouble to prepare? Should we try to resurrect every lost tradition, or should we accept that some things pass away naturally and focus our efforts on creating good, new traditions rather than maintaining old ones? These aren't easy questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they're worth asking, worth struggling with, worth holding in creative tension, rather than resolving too quickly in one direction or another. The seeds wait. In the frozen vault in Norway, in seed banks around the world, in the packets of heritage seed companies, in the envelopes carefully saved by elderly gardeners who grew these plants because their parents grew them, because their grandparents grew them, because someone in the chain remembered and passed the seeds along. The seeds wait, patient as only seeds can be, for someone to plant them, to give them soil and water and sun, to allow them to fulfill their purpose, to grow, to flower, to produce food and beauty and more seeds, to continue the cycle. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it's enough that the possibility remains that the seeds exist, that someone somewhere is remembering, is planting, is maintaining the fragile thread of tradition. Maybe we don't need everyone to grow Skirit or Alexanders or Good King Henry. Maybe we just need a few people to remember, to keep the seeds alive, to maintain the possibility that others, someday, might want to rediscover these forgotten flavors, these lost connections to the past. The metaphor extends beyond vegetables, of course. What else have we forgotten that waits like seeds in the soil? What other knowledge? What other ways of being? What other traditions and practices lie dormant, preserved in texts or memories or the isolated efforts of dedicated enthusiasts, waiting for rediscovery? And what will we, in our turn, preserve for those who come after? What seeds will we save? What knowledge will we pass on? What will we remember? And what will we allow to slip into forgetfulness? These are questions each generation must answer. The answers shape not only the present, but the future determine what possibilities remain open. What options are preserved? What diversity survives the filtering process of time and change? For now, the seeds wait. In waiting, they remind us that nothing is ever completely lost as long as someone remembers. As long as the seeds are saved, as long as the possibility remains that dormant life might once again spring into green and growing reality, it begins quietly, as most important things do. Not with fanfare or official announcements, but with individuals making small choices, driven by curiosity or nostalgia, or simply the desire for something different. An elderly gardener, remembering vegetables from childhood, seeks out seeds and plants them once more. A historian, researching medieval agriculture, decides to try growing some of the plants described in ancient texts. A chef looking for unusual ingredients to distinguish their restaurant discovers forgotten vegetables and brings them back to modern plates. These small acts, multiplied across thousands of individuals, begin to form a movement. By the late 20th century, concern about agricultural biodiversity loss was growing among scientists and agriculturalists. The Green Revolution had brought tremendous benefits, preventing famines, feeding billions, but it had also led to dramatic genetic narrowing. The thousands of varieties of wheat, rice, corn, other staples that had existed globally were being rapidly replaced by a handful of high-yielding varieties. The concern wasn't purely academic. Genetic uniformity creates vulnerability. If all the crops in a region are genetically identical, a single pest or disease can devastate the entire crop. This had happened before. The Irish potato. Famine of the 1840s was worsened by the fact that Irish potatoes were genetically uniform, all susceptible to the late blight that destroyed them. The only defense against such catastrophes is diversity, maintaining many different varieties so that if one is vulnerable, others will resist. This realization led to the establishment of seed banks around the world, systematic efforts to collect and preserve crop genetic diversity before it disappeared entirely. Scientists and agriculturalists traveled to remote regions, seeking out traditional farmers who still grew heirloom varieties. They collected seeds, cataloged them, stored them in refrigerated vaults designed to preserve them for decades or centuries. Our forgotten vegetables were among the seeds collected, not priorities, certainly compared to major crops like rice and wheat, but included nonetheless, preserved as part of the broad effort to save as much diversity as possible. Skirat Alexander's, salsify, Good King Henry seeds of these plants made their way into collections, were cataloged and stored, were preserved against the day when someone might want them again. And that day came. Sooner than the preservers might have expected. By the 1980s and 1990s, a counter-movement to industrial agriculture was growing. Organic farming, sustainable agriculture, permaculture. These approaches emphasized diversity, ecological health, local adaptation, and they created demand for varieties that had been forgotten in the industrial model. Seed companies began to emerge that specialized in heirloom and rare varieties. Companies like Seeds of Change, Seed Savers Exchange, Heritage Seed Library, they offered seeds of vegetables that hadn't been commonly available for decades or even centuries. Their catalogs read like history books, each variety accompanied by stories of its origin, its traditional uses, its near extinction and preservation. And people bought these seeds? Gardeners tired of the limited selection at mainstream nurseries. Interested in history, concerned about biodiversity loss, or simply curious about unusual plants. They bought skirat seeds, planted them, discovered what medieval monks had known, that properly grown and prepared. Skirat is delicious, distinctive, worth the extra effort. They bought Good King Henry seeds, established patches in their gardens, found that this perennial vegetable required almost no maintenance while providing both asparagus-like shoots in spring and spinach-like leaves through summer. They experimented with salsify and Alexander's, shared their experiences online, posted recipes, compared notes on cultivation. The internet accelerated this process dramatically. Before, a gardener interested in unusual vegetables was isolated, dependent on whatever information they could find in books. But with the internet came forums, blogs, social media groups dedicated to heirloom gardening, seed saving, forgotten vegetables. Knowledge that had been scattered and inaccessible became centralized and shareable. Enthusiasts from around the world could connect, exchange information, share seeds. A movement called slow food, founded in Italy in response to the opening of a McDonald's in Rome, explicitly championed food biodiversity and traditional foodways. They created an arc of taste, a catalog of endangered foods, including plant varieties, animal breeds, and traditional preparation methods designed to draw attention to what was being lost and to encourage preservation and revival. Forgotten vegetables featured prominently in the arc of taste. Skirat appeared, along with Good King Henry and various regional varieties of other vegetables. The slow food movement encouraged restaurants to feature these ingredients, organized tastings and educational events, published cookbooks featuring traditional recipes and forgotten foods. High-end restaurants began to take notice, chefs looking to distinguish themselves. To offer diners something they couldn't get elsewhere began seeking out unusual ingredients. Forgotten vegetables, with their historical significance and distinctive flavors, were perfect. A dish featuring skirat or Alexander's or salsify became a selling point, a way of demonstrating culinary knowledge and creativity. This restaurant interest created an economic incentive for farmers to grow forgotten vegetables again. Small-scale farmers serving local markets could charge premium prices for these unusual crops. Farmers markets themselves experiencing a revival as consumers sought alternatives to supermarkets provided venues for selling vegetables that would never appear in conventional stores. The revival remained niche. Forgotten vegetables weren't replacing potatoes or Carrots or lettuce in the mainstream food system, but they were no longer on the brink of extinction. They had gone from being forgotten to being remembered, from being absent to being occasionally present, from dying traditions to reviving ones. Educational institutions got involved too. Heritage gardens at living history museums began growing period-appropriate vegetables, including forgotten varieties. Visitors could see, and sometimes taste, vegetables that their ancestors had eaten. Botanical gardens established collections of heirloom vegetables, both to preserve genetic diversity and to educate visitors about agricultural history. Home gardeners, particularly those interested in self-sufficiency or historical reenactment or simple curiosity, became crucial to the revival. Each gardener who planted forgotten vegetables saved their seeds and shared them with others became a link in the chain of preservation, a guardian of diversity, a keeper of tradition, and some of these gardeners discovered what the medieval monks had known, that growing food creates a particular kind of connection to place, to season, to history, to the fundamental processes that sustain life. That there's satisfaction in eating skirret you grew yourself, harvested at the perfect moment, prepared with care. That good King Henry, returning each spring without being asked, becomes a kind of companion, a living connection to past seasons and future ones. The revival is incomplete. Most people still haven't heard of these vegetables, much less tasted them. The culinary knowledge is still fractured, with enthusiasts experimenting and sharing recipes, but without the deep, embedded tradition that once existed. And the economic incentives still favor mainstream crops over unusual ones, but the trajectory has changed. 20 years ago, these vegetables seemed headed for complete extinction outside of seed banks. Now, they're experiencing a modest renaissance. Seeds are available. People are growing them. Knowledge is being shared. The tradition, though broken, is being pieced back together. There's something deeply hopeful about this. It suggests that loss isn't always permanent, that what's been forgotten can be remembered, that traditions can be revived even after the chain of transmission has been broken. It's not the same as if the tradition had never been interrupted. Some knowledge, some connection to the past is lost permanently when living tradition dies. But it's not nothing. It's recovery, partial and imperfect, but real. And it suggests that people, at least some people, value diversity, history, connection to the past. That not everyone is content with the narrow range of options offered by industrial food systems. That there's hunger, not just physical hunger, but spiritual hunger, for something more varied, more meaningful, more connected to human history and natural processes, the revival of forgotten. Vegetables is part of a larger pattern. Heritage livestock breeds being preserved. Traditional food preparation methods being revived. Heirloom fruit varieties being planted again. It's a recognition that modern efficiency, for all its genuine benefits, has costs. And some of those costs, in terms of diversity, resilience, cultural richness, and connection to the past, are worth paying attention to. Worth trying to mitigate. Will skirret and Alexanders and salsify and good King Henry ever return to widespread cultivation? Probably not. The conditions that made them marginal to modern agriculture haven't fundamentally changed. But will they survive? Yes, probably. Will some people continue growing them, appreciating them, passing them on? Yes, and that's enough to prevent extinction, enough to keep the possibility alive, enough to preserve the option for future generations who might, in a changed world with changed needs, find value in vegetables their ancestors had forgotten. The quiet revival continues. Each spring, gardeners somewhere plant forgotten vegetables. Each season, chefs somewhere feature them on menus. Each year, seed savers somewhere collect seeds and share them. The tradition continues, not as it once was, broken, embedded, taken for granted, but as something more conscious, more deliberate, more fragile, but also more intentional. And in that continuation, there's something beautiful. Something that speaks to human capacity, not just to destroy and forget, but also to preserve and remember, to value diversity in history, to maintain connections across time. We're not doomed to lose everything from the past. We can choose what to remember, what to preserve, what to carry forward into the future. The forgotten vegetables are being remembered. And in their remembering, they remind us that nothing is truly lost as long as someone chooses to remember, to preserve, to pass on. The evening has deepened now into full darkness. You've returned to the monastery garden where this journey began, through the old wooden gate, down the gravel paths, into the space enclosed by ancient stone walls. But the garden has changed, or perhaps you have changed, perhaps both. The moon is rising, full and bright, washing the garden in silver light. Everything is transformed by this luminescence. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The familiar becomes mysterious. The vegetable beds are pools of shadow with highlights of reflected moonlight on leaves still wet with dew. The paths seem to glow faintly, as though lit from within. You can see the plants now. If you look carefully, the shapes, at least if not the details. Here are the bushy forms of beans on their poles, casting long shadows. Here are the lower spreading shapes of good King Henry, leaves silvered by moonlight. Here are the tall, stately forms of Alexanders gone to seed, their umbels catching light like tiny stars. And you understand something you didn't understand before. This garden is eternal. Not in the sense that it never changes. Everything here is constantly changing, growing, dying, being reborn. But eternal in the sense that it participates in patterns that transcend individual lives, individual gardens, even individual civilizations. Seeds become plants. Plants produce seeds. The cycle continues, has continued for millions of years, will continue for millions more. Human beings participate in this cycle. We plant, we tend, we harvest, we save seeds, we plant again, but we don't control it. We're part of it, but not the most important part. The fundamental pattern would continue even without us, as it did for eons before humans existed. This is both humbling and comforting. Humbling because it puts human efforts in perspective. We're not as important as we sometimes think we are. The garden doesn't exist for us. We exist in relationship with it, interdependent but not dominant. But comforting too, because it means the pattern is larger and more resilient than any individual or culture. Even when specific traditions are broken, when specific plants are forgotten, when specific knowledge is lost, the fundamental pattern continues. Life persists. Seeds wait. The possibility of renewal remains. Walk with me now through this moonlit garden, and let us reflect on what this journey has shown us. We began with forgotten vegetables, Skirit Alexanders, salsify, good King Henry plants that were once common and are now rare. We explored their histories, their cultivation, their preparation, their flavors. We met the monks who grew them, the gardeners who tended them, the cooks who prepared them. But this story has never been only about vegetables. It's been about memory and forgetting, about continuity and change, about what we preserve and what we allow to slip away. It's been about tradition, both its value and its fragility, both the richness it provides and the effort required to maintain it. It's been about cycles of seasons of growth, of generations, civilizations. The forgotten vegetables are emblematic of larger patterns. They represent the thousands of plant varieties that have disappeared from cultivation as agriculture has simplified and standardized. They represent traditional knowledge that has been lost as ways of life have changed. They represent connections to place, to season, to history that have been severed as we become more mobile, more globalized, more disconnected from the sources of our food. But they also represent possibility. The possibility of recovery, of remembering, of reconnecting. The possibility that what seems lost might be found again, that broken traditions might be repaired, that diversity might be restored, and they remind us that we have choices. We can choose what to remember and what to forget, what to preserve and what to let go, what to carry forward and what to leave behind. These choices matter. They shape not only our present, but our future, determining what possibilities remain open, what options are preserved, what diversity survives. The moon is high now. Directly overhead, flooding the garden with light, every leaf seems to glow. Every stone seems luminous. And in this light, You can soar, imagine, you can see other gardens other times. The Roman garden where Skirt first came to northern Europe. The medieval monastery where monks first pressed good King Henry seeds into soil. The cottage gardens where ordinary people grew these vegetables for centuries. The heritage gardens where enthusiasts are now growing them again. All these gardens exist simultaneously somehow in this moment, this place. Past and present and future, collapsing into a single, eternal now. The monk who planted Skirt centuries ago and the modern gardener planting it today are engaged in the same act. Connected across time by that simple gesture of pressing seed into soil. This is the eternal garden. Not a specific place, but a pattern. An idea, a relationship between humans and plants that has existed as long as agriculture, that transcends any particular time or culture. Every garden, every plot, every pot of herbs on a windowsill participates in this pattern. This eternal conversation between people and plants, between human intention and natural process. You kneel now beside a bed where Skirt is growing, or was growing, or will grow. Time is strange in this moonlit place. You press your hand into the soil, feel its coolness, its dampness, its life. This soil has fed countless plants, has been enriched by countless seasons of growth and decay. It remembers, in its way, everything that's grown here. And it waits, patient as only earth can be, for whatever will be planted next. This is the gift of the garden. It teaches patience, teaches cyclical thinking, teaches humility and hope in equal measure. It reminds us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, something that was here before us and will be here after us. It gives us a way to participate in that larger pattern, to contribute to the ongoing story of life on Earth, and it offers sanctuary, a place of peace, a place of connection, a place where the urgent noise of modern life fades away and we can hear quieter, older rhythms. The rhythm of seasons turning, the rhythm of growth and rest, the rhythm of seed and plant and seed again. The night insects are singing, now crickets and katydids, their chirps and trills creating a symphony of small sounds. Somewhere an owl calls. Somewhere small creatures rustle through the undergrowth. The garden at night is not silent, but full of life. It's full of activity invisible to human eyes, but no less real for being unseen. You stand and brush the soil from your hands. The monastery buildings are dark and silent. The monks are sleeping, their day's work done, their prayers said, their rest earned. The garden sleeps too, in its way. Though its sleep is different from ours, more like a pause, a resting between breaths, than true unconsciousness. As you prepare to leave this place, to pass back through the wooden gate into your own time, your own world, you carry something with you. Not just knowledge about forgotten vegetables, though you have that. Not just historical information, though you have that too, but something deeper, a sense of connection, a feeling of participation in patterns larger than individual lives, an awareness that the past is not truly past but present, persistent. Available to those who choose to remember, the forgotten vegetables are not lost. They wait as seeds wait, for the right conditions to grow again. And you, yes, you who have walked this garden path with me, are part of those right conditions. Every person who remembers, who values diversity, who seeks connection to history and to the earth, each one contributes to the possibility of recovery, of revival, of the continuation of traditions that seemed broken. The gate stands open. Beyond it, the path leads back to the present day, to modern life with all its complexities and challenges. But the garden remains eternal in its cycles, patient in its rhythms, waiting for anyone who chooses to enter, to learn, to participate in the ancient partnership between humans and plants that has sustained our species since agriculture began. The moon is setting now, the sky beginning to lighten in the east with the first hint of dawn. The garden transitions once more from the mystery of night to the clarity of day. And with that transition, it's time for this journey to endure, to pause. For the garden's story never ends. It continues, season after season, generation after generation. An eternal cycle of growth and rest, planting and harvest, memory and forgetting, loss and recovery. Thank you for walking these paths with me. Thank you for learning the names of plants most people have forgotten. Thank you for caring about diversity in history and the preservation of knowledge. In caring, you ensure that the forgetting will not be complete, that the seeds will not remain dormant forever, that the tradition broken but not destroyed might yet be continued. The gate closes softly behind you, but you can return whenever you wish. The garden is always there, always waiting, always ready to teach its lessons to those willing to listen. All you need to do is push open that old wooden gate, step through, and allow yourself to enter into the eternal rhythms of seed and soil, plant and harvest, memory and renewal. The journey is ending now. The story is complete, or as complete as any story ever is. For the garden's tale continues beyond words, beyond narratives. Into the living world where seeds still wait and plants still grow in the cycles, still turn regardless of whether anyone remembers to tell their stories. You're standing at the gate once more. But everything is quiet now, deeply peaceful. The frenetic energy of modern life seems very far away. Here, in this threshold space between waking and sleeping, between past and present, between memory and dream, there is only calm. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop. Let the tension you've been carrying, perhaps, without even knowing you carried it, release and flow away like water into soil. You are safe here. You are held. You are part of the eternal pattern that enfolds all life. The vegetables we've explored together, skewer it with its sweet, clustered roots. Alexander's with its bold spring stems, Salsify with its oyster flavor and patient growth, Good King Henry with its perennial faithfulness. They've taught us something beyond their own stories. They've shown us that nothing truly disappears if someone remembers, that seeds can wait centuries and still hold life, that traditions can be broken but also mended, that what seems lost might yet be found. But more than this, they've reminded us of fundamentals we sometimes forget in the noise and hurry of modern existence, that we are part of nature, not separate from it. That patience is not a waste of time, but a way of honoring natural rhythms. That diversity is not mere decoration, but essential resilience. That the past is not dead, but alive, present. Speaking to us if we choose to listen, these lessons extend far beyond gardening, beyond food, beyond vegetables. They're lessons about how to live, patiently, attentively, in connection with others and with the living world, aware of being part of something larger than ourselves, grateful for what we've inherited from the past, and mindful of what we'll pass on to the future. The garden has been our teacher, and it's been a gentle teacher, asking nothing but attention, offering everything in return. The soil's coolness beneath your hands, the scent of herbs in evening air, the sight of moonlight on leaves, the taste of vegetables fresh from the earth, the satisfaction of seed planted, plant tended, harvest gathered, the peace of participating in patterns older than human civilization and likely to outlast it as you rest now. As sleep approaches, or perhaps has already arrived, as consciousness becomes dreamlike and boundaries blur between inner and outer, past and present, waking and sleeping carry these images with you. The monastery garden at twilight, lanterns glowing softly along the paths, the monks in their brown robes moving quietly between the beds, the vegetables growing in their rows, each one a small miracle of seed transformed into nourishment. The seasons turning, the wheel of the year rolling forward, everything changing and everything remaining the same. Let these images soothe you. Let them settle into your mind like seeds into soil, where they might take root and grow into something, perhaps curiosity that leads you to seek out these forgotten plants. Perhaps awareness that changes how you think about food and history. Perhaps simply a sense of connection to the long story of humans and plants, of cultivation and care, of patience and harvest. The forgotten vegetables themselves are resting now, in seed banks and heritage gardens, in the plots of enthusiastic gardeners, in the memories of elderly farmers, in the soil where they grow wild, and in the texts where their cultivation is recorded. They rest. They wait. They hold their potential in stillness, ready for the moment when they're needed again. And you are resting too. Your journey through the monastery garden is complete. You've walked the paths, met the monks, learned the plants' names and stories, understood something of what was lost and what might yet be recovered. The knowledge is yours now, to keep or to share, to use or to simply hold as an interesting piece of history. But beyond knowledge, there's something else you carry with you, a feeling, a sense, an understanding that can't be fully put into words, the feeling of connection, the sense of being part of something vast and ancient, the understanding that human life, at its best, is lived in partnership with the natural world in awareness of cycles and seasons. In gratitude for the gifts of sun and rain and fertile soil, let this understanding settle deep within you as you drift towards sleep or deeper rest. Let it become part of you, not just something you know, but something you are. Part of the eternal garden, part of the great cycle. Part of the story that has no beginning and no end, but only the continuous present of life renewing itself. Season after season, year after year, generation after generation. The gate is closed now. The garden fades from view, or perhaps your eyes have closed. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. But you can return whenever you wish. The garden is always there, always waiting. All you need to do is remember, is choose to step through the gate, is allow yourself to enter once more into the peace and presence of that green growing place where time moves differently and what seemed forgotten is remembered again. Sleep now. Sleep is what you need. Rest, if rest is what you seek. Dream, if dreams are calling. The garden will be here when you return. The vegetables will continue their cycles. The seeds will wait. The tradition will persist, fragile but not broken, threatened but not destroyed, remembered by those who choose to remember. And in that remembering, in that choosing, in that care, there is hope. Not naive hope that everything lost can be fully recovered, but realistic hope that what matters most can be preserved, that diversity can be maintained, that connections across time can be honored and continued, that the eternal garden can remain eternal, tended by each generation in turn, passed on intact to those who come after. This is your inheritance and your responsibility. Though it's a gentle responsibility, asking only awareness and care. You don't need to become a gardener or grow forgotten vegetables or save seeds or do anything specific. You need only remember. Remember that diversity matters. Remember that history lives in the present. Remember that you're part of larger patterns. Remember that small acts of preservation and care, multiplied across many people, can save what seemed lost. Remember the garden. Remember the vegetables. Remember the monks who tended them and the traditions they maintained. Remember that seeds can wait centuries and still hold life. Remember that what's forgotten can be remembered, that what's lost can sometimes be found, that endings are not always final and sometimes contain within them the seeds of new beginnings. The night is deep now, or morning is coming, or time has dissolved entirely. Rest in the eternal garden, where everything is always as it should be, where the cycles continue regardless of human anxiety, where seeds wait with infinite patience for the right moment to grow, where the soil remembers everything and forgives everything and holds all life in its dark. Nurturing, embrace, rest, dream, remember, forget. The garden will be here when you return. The seeds are waiting. The story continues. All is well. All is well. All is well.